Hey everybody, this is Sleepy Crime, and today I'm gonna help you. I know you want to fall asleep to this video, so before you do, put a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you from and what time are you watching? Make yourself comfortable and relax. In the early hours of June 5th, 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Ann Smart was abducted from her bedroom in the Federal Heights neighborhood of Salt Lake City, Utah. It was a quiet upper-middle-class area where violent crime was rare. The Smart family, Ed and Lois, along with their 6 children, were asleep in their home when the abduction occurred. Elizabeth shared a room with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Mary Catherine was awakened by a noise. She saw a man with a knife at Elizabeth's bedside, whispering threats. The man told Elizabeth to get up and come with him, or he would harm her and her family. Too frightened to alert anyone immediately, Mary Catherine pretended to be asleep and waited until the house was quiet. When she was sure the man and Elizabeth were gone, she rushed to her parents' room and told them what she had witnessed. The family called 911 shortly after 4 a.m., and Salt Lake City police arrived promptly. Officers began searching the house and surrounding area for any signs of forced entry. They discovered that a screen window in the kitchen had been cut, which investigators concluded was the point of entry. The Smart home quickly became the focal point of an intense investigation. Law enforcement canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed neighbors, and initiated a house-to-house search. Bloodhounds were brought in, but were unable to track a scent beyond the yard. Police believed that Elizabeth had been taken by someone on foot, then possibly driven away. Her parents made an emotional plea to the public, appearing on local television to ask for Elizabeth's safe return. The day of the abduction saw a rapid response from both law enforcement and volunteers. Hundreds of people gathered to help search for Elizabeth, combing nearby canyons, parks, and vacant buildings. Despite the swift mobilization, no immediate leads emerged. Authorities feared that with each passing hour, the trail was growing colder. By that evening, the story began to circulate nationally. News stations broadcast images of Elizabeth in a red shirt and blue pants, the clothes she was reportedly wearing when she was taken. The FBI joined the investigation, lending their resources and expertise. Though the Smart family remained hopeful, investigators acknowledged the case was entering critical hours, where the likelihood of recovery often diminished. Mary Catherine provided the only description of the abductor at the time, a man wearing light-colored clothes and a golf cap, with a soft voice and a threatening demeanor. The authorities released a composite sketch based on her recollection, but without more concrete evidence, they had little to go on. Elizabeth Smart had vanished without a trace. In the hours following Elizabeth Smart's disappearance, the Salt Lake City Police Department launched a massive search operation. Officers secured the Smart residence, treating it as an active crime scene. Evidence technicians collected fingerprints, examined the cut window screen, and photographed the bedroom where Elizabeth had last been seen. Meanwhile, detectives began coordinating efforts with the FBI, the Utah Department of Public Safety, and local volunteers. Early on June 5th, police interviewed Mary Catherine Smart again. Although traumatized, she remained the key eyewitness. She reiterated her account. A man with a knife had threatened Elizabeth and led her out of their bedroom. Detectives focused on the possibility of an intruder known to the family, perhaps someone who had previously worked in the home. The Smarts provided the names of recent workers, including a homeless man who had done roofing repairs in November 2001 and was known only as Emmanuel. This detail, while noted, did not become a priority lead at the time. Within 48 hours, over 2,000 volunteers joined organized searches. They covered the hills, canyons, and trails surrounding Salt Lake City. Helicopters with infrared equipment scanned wooded areas. The terrain was steep and vast, and searchers feared Elizabeth might have been hidden or hurt somewhere nearby. An official Amber Alert was not immediately issued, as Utah lacked a statewide protocol for such alerts at that time. Still, local authorities mobilized rapidly. Flyers bearing Elizabeth's picture blanketed the area. Her face appeared on billboards, news broadcasts, and in newspapers. Family and friends handed out thousands of leaflets. Ed and Lois Smart gave tearful interviews, urging the public to remain vigilant and report anything suspicious. Police also turned their attention to known sex offenders in the area. More than 100 individuals were interviewed. Homes were searched and alibis verified. Tips flooded in, reaching over 1,500 within the first week. Each one was logged, prioritized, and investigated. Despite the volume of information, none led to a breakthrough. Investigators considered multiple theories: a random break-in, an abduction by someone with religious or cult-related motives, or a targeted kidnapping. The lack of physical evidence, no footprints, fibers, or confirmed sightings, stymied progress. By June 10th, just 5 days after Elizabeth's abduction, the reward for her safe return had grown to $250,000, offered by anonymous donors and coordinated by the Smarts. The family remained active in the search, coordinating with law enforcement and appearing on national television programs such as Good Morning America and Larry King Live. Despite exhaustive ground searches and national exposure, Elizabeth remained missing. Authorities held regular press briefings, often with little new information to share. Mary Catherine's description of the kidnapper as calm but scary and like he knew what he was doing stuck with investigators. However, without additional clues, the case appeared to be stalling. Still, the Smarts refused to give up hope. Elizabeth's story was now known across the country, and the pressure on law enforcement to find her grew by the day. Within days of Elizabeth Smart's disappearance, her case attracted national media attention. The combination of a middle-class family, a dramatic late-night abduction, and a photogenic young victim struck a chord with the American public. News outlets across the country began covering the case around the clock. Television programs such as CNN, NBC's Dateline, and America's Most Wanted aired segments featuring interviews with the Smart family and footage from community searches. The media played a critical role in sustaining public interest. Elizabeth's parents appeared frequently on national television, pleading for information and keeping the spotlight on their daughter. Their emotional appeals humanized the case and underscored their belief that Elizabeth was still alive. The family worked with public relations advisors to coordinate appearances, issue statements, and manage growing media interest. Their central message remained consistent: find Elizabeth and bring her home. With the growing spotlight came the mobilization of advocacy groups. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children joined the effort, offering resources and assisting in the distribution of Elizabeth's image. Her photo, smiling, blonde, and framed in innocence, became a symbol of the case. The contrast between her youthful appearance and the violence of her abduction fueled public empathy. The media coverage also had a tangible effect on the investigation. Tips began pouring in from across the country. People reported seeing Elizabeth in different states, often accompanied by suspicious adults. While most tips proved false or unverifiable, investigators remained committed to following each lead. the national attention created both opportunity and challenge. Information flowed in abundance, but sorting through it consumed significant time and resources. In Salt Lake City, the Smarts organized a massive public awareness campaign. They distributed over 300,000 flyers, placed newspaper ads, and launched a website dedicated to Elizabeth's recovery. Anonymous donors continued to increase the reward fund, which eventually exceeded $300,000. The community's support, coupled with the constant media coverage, created a high-profile search effort rarely seen in local missing person cases. Yet, as weeks passed without a major breakthrough, some questioned the effectiveness of the broad media campaign. Critics noted that cases involving children of color or from lower-income families rarely received similar attention. The term "missing white woman syndrome" began circulating in media critiques, highlighting disparities in national coverage of abduction cases. Nonetheless, the spotlight on Elizabeth's case remained unwavering. Law enforcement worked in tandem with media outlets, holding press conferences and providing updates even when little progress had been made. The Salt Lake City Police Department appointed a public information officer to manage inquiries and deliver official statements. This transparency, though sometimes frustratingly vague, helped sustain public trust in the ongoing search. By late June 2002, 3 weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, her name had become familiar to households nationwide. The persistence of media attention ensured her story would not fade, even as investigators struggled to uncover actionable leads. Her image, constantly in the public eye, kept hope alive for her family, for her community, and for a country now emotionally invested in her return. As the investigation progressed into July 2002 with few new leads, detectives intensified their focus on people with connections to the Smart family. One name soon emerged as a person of interest: Richard Ricci, a 48-year-old man with a criminal history who had previously worked as a handyman for the Smarts. Ricci had been employed intermittently in 2001 to perform repairs and yard work at the Smart home. His prior convictions for burglary made him a suspect worth examining. Police brought Ricci in for questioning and searched his home on July 11, 2002. During the search, investigators reportedly found items that had been stolen from the Smart residence months earlier, including a piece of jewelry. This discovery prompted Ricci's immediate arrest, not for kidnapping, but for parole violations and unrelated burglaries. Although he denied involvement in Elizabeth's disappearance, police considered him their primary suspect. Law enforcement officials believed Ricci may have used his prior access to the home to plan the abduction. Investigators theorized that he knew the layout of the house and may have known how to enter quietly. The public was informed that Ricci was under suspicion, and his name was widely reported in the media. This focus on Ricci shifted resources and public attention away from other leads, including the man once identified only as Emmanuel. Despite intense scrutiny, there was no physical evidence linking Ricci to the kidnapping. His alibi was partially verified. He had been at home with his wife on the night of Elizabeth's abduction, though investigators questioned the timeline. Police subjected Ricci to multiple interrogations and polygraph tests. He remained adamant about his innocence. As the weeks went on, Ricci's name became synonymous with the case in the public eye. The Smart family, desperate for answers, cautiously deferred to the police investigation, but privately expressed concern that other leads were being overlooked. Mary Catherine Smart, meanwhile, remained unsure if Ricci matched the voice or figure of the man she had seen in the bedroom. Still traumatized, she could not confirm a visual identification. In August 2002, Ricci suffered a cerebral hemorrhage while in custody at the Utah State Prison. He fell into a coma and died on August 30th. His death sparked new debate and confusion. With Ricci no longer alive, investigators lost the ability to interrogate him further. Police did not officially clear him, but acknowledged there was no conclusive evidence tying him to the crime. The case once again stalled. The media coverage that had once proclaimed Ricci as a likely suspect began to waver. News outlets raised questions about whether authorities had prematurely focused on the wrong man. Law enforcement defended their actions, emphasizing Ricci's criminal past and possession of stolen items. However, behind the scenes, the Smart family urged police to revisit other possibilities, including leads initially dismissed months earlier. The case had now reached a troubling impasse. The prime suspect was dead. No new evidence had emerged, and Elizabeth remained missing. The pressure on the police intensified, and public confidence in the investigation began to erode. Yet, unknown to the public, the real kidnappers had already moved Elizabeth to a new location, still within miles of her family's home. As the official investigation focused on Richard Ricci, another figure, mentioned only in passing, remained overlooked. Months earlier, Elizabeth's younger sister Mary Catherine had recalled a man named Emmanuel, who had once worked briefly at the Smart home. He had approached the family in 2001, presenting himself as a homeless preacher in need of food and work. Out of compassion, the Smarts had offered him a day's labor, during which he helped with roofing and other odd jobs. This Emmanuel was in fact Brian David Mitchell, a self-proclaimed religious prophet with a disturbing history. Born in 1953, Mitchell had a long record of unstable behavior, religious fanaticism, and estrangement from his family. After a failed marriage and years of drifting, he began referring to himself as Emmanuel, claiming to receive revelations from God. In the late 1980s, Mitchell met Wanda Eileen Barzee, a woman who became both his wife and accomplice. Barzee, 15 years his senior, shared his religious delusions and supported his self-styled prophetic mission. Mitchell authored a 27-page manifesto titled The Book of Emmanuel David Isaiah, in which he outlined his belief that he had been chosen to lead a divine mission and take 7 wives. He considered himself above conventional law and claimed spiritual authority to act on his revelations. Those close to him described him as controlling, manipulative, and obsessed with religious dominance. In late 2001, after the brief work at the Smart home, Mitchell fixated on Elizabeth as a prospective second wife. According to later court testimony, he devised a plan to kidnap her, believing it a fulfillment of divine instruction. In the early morning of June 5, 2002, he entered the Smart house through a cut screen, armed with a knife, and abducted Elizabeth while her sister lay awake in the same room. He led her through the woods behind the house to a campsite in the Wasatch Mountains. Wanda Barzee was waiting there. Upon Elizabeth's arrival, Mitchell conducted what he called a sealing ceremony, declaring her his wife in a religious ritual. From that point forward, Elizabeth was forced to live under the names Shir Jashub and Esther, stripped of her identity and subjected to physical and psychological abuse. Mitchell insisted she follow strict religious protocols, including wearing a robe and veil in public. She was isolated, monitored, and coerced into compliance through threats, starvation, and fear. During this period, Mitchell and Barzee moved Elizabeth between several remote campsites and shelters, often remaining within a few miles of her family's home. Despite being in public on a few occasions, Elizabeth's appearance was concealed by layers of clothing and a face covering, rendering her unrecognizable. Mitchell regularly preached on street corners and wandered the city streets while Elizabeth waited nearby, veiled and silent. Investigators had not linked Emmanuel to Mitchell due to a lack of full identity information. When the family had initially provided the name, police did not prioritize the lead, partly due to the focus on Ricci. It would take months and a breakthrough from Mary Catherine to reintroduce Mitchell into the investigation. At this stage, however, Mitchell and Barzee remained free, their identities hidden under assumed names, and Elizabeth still captive. While the public believed the trail had gone cold, the real perpetrators continued moving in plain sight. Elizabeth Smart's captivity began immediately after her abduction on June 5, 2002. Taken on foot through the woods behind her family's Salt Lake City home, she was led over rugged terrain for hours before arriving at a remote campsite in the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains. The location, hidden in thick brush and difficult to access, became her prison for the next several months. At the campsite, Mitchell, who called himself Emmanuel, conducted a religious ceremony declaring Elizabeth his wife. Barzee participated, reinforcing Mitchell's claims of divine authority. The ceremony was not consensual. Elizabeth, terrified and in shock, was forced to comply under threat of violence. That night marked the beginning of a prolonged period of abuse. Mitchell sexually assaulted Elizabeth daily, using religious justification to manipulate and control her. Barzee played an active role in maintaining Elizabeth's captivity, enforcing silence, rationing food, and helping Mitchell with his rituals. To isolate her, Mitchell imposed strict rules. Elizabeth was required to wear a robe-like garment and a veil that concealed her face. She was forbidden from using her real name and instead called Esther or Shir Jashub. Speaking without permission was prohibited, and attempts to escape were met with threats to harm her family. Her captors frequently reminded her that if she disobeyed, they would return and kill her parents and siblings. Elizabeth's days were marked by monotony, deprivation, and indoctrination. Food was scarce, often just canned beans or crusts of bread, and hygiene was nearly non-existent. Despite this, Elizabeth tried to retain a sense of hope. She recited prayers, remembered songs, and focused on her family to endure the psychological toll of captivity. In late summer 2002, after about 2 months in the original campsite, Mitchell decided they needed to move. Concerned about approaching cold weather and possible discovery, he led Elizabeth and Barzee west toward California. The group traveled mostly on foot, hitchhiking part of the way. To prevent recognition, Elizabeth was kept veiled, and Mitchell often claimed she was his daughter or religious follower. In public, Elizabeth remained silent under threat, even when in proximity to others. The trio spent time in San Diego County, camping in canyons and panhandling for money. Mitchell continued preaching on streets while Barzee kept Elizabeth hidden. Despite encounters with passers-by and even law enforcement, her appearance and silence masked her identity. In one instance, a police officer spoke to the group, but accepted Mitchell's explanation without demanding identification. By fall 2002, they returned to Salt Lake City, setting up a new camp in the hills above the city. Elizabeth remained in disguise, enduring the same strict rules and abuse. Despite being so close to her home, she had no opportunity to escape or signal for help. Mitchell used fear and manipulation effectively, instilling a belief that rescue was impossible and punishment inevitable. Throughout this period, Elizabeth never lost hope entirely. She clung to memories of her family and dreams of returning home. While she was unable to escape, she maintained her mental resolve, resisting Mitchell's attempts to erase her identity completely. Her captivity, lasting 9 months, was a test of survival under extreme psychological and physical coercion. Despite the conditions, Elizabeth remained observant, quietly gathering details and waiting for any chance to be rescued. During the 9 months of Elizabeth Smart's captivity, multiple opportunities arose in which her rescue might have been possible. Each instance, however, was thwarted by a mix of deception, missed cues, and limited awareness among those who encountered her and her captors. In retrospect, these moments illustrated how close Elizabeth had come to freedom, and how easily those chances slipped away. One early missed opportunity occurred during the group's time in San Diego County in the fall of 2002. While panhandling and preaching, Brian David Mitchell frequently brought Elizabeth into public spaces. Dressed in layers of robes and veils, she stood silently beside him while he delivered sermons on street corners. Her unusual appearance drew attention, but Mitchell explained that she was part of his religious sect and followed strict modesty rules. This explanation, combined with Elizabeth's silence and heavy disguise, prevented closer scrutiny. In October 2002, a Salt Lake City resident who had seen Mitchell preaching locally before the abduction spotted him again, this time with 2 women. Suspicious of his appearance and recognizing the man's distinct behavior, the citizen reported the sighting to the police. However, Mitchell's common alias, Emmanuel, and his lack of a fixed address made follow-up difficult. Police logged the tip, but failed to identify the individuals. Another critical juncture came in early 2003, when Mary Catherine Smart experienced a sudden realization. She had been re-examining the night of the abduction in her mind and remembered that Emmanuel, the man who had worked at their house, matched the voice of the kidnapper. She informed her parents, who then urged police to investigate the man further. This time, the family took initiative by contacting a sketch artist. With help from Mary Catherine, they produced a composite image of Emmanuel, which was released to the public in February 2003. The sketch marked a turning point. Shortly after its distribution, a viewer of America's Most Wanted called in with a potential identification. The caller recognized Emmanuel as Brian David Mitchell, a man with a criminal record and a history of religious extremism. The lead was passed on to the Salt Lake City Police Department and FBI, who began re-examining Mitchell's background. In early March 2003, a crucial tip came from a citizen in Sandy, Utah. She had spotted Mitchell, Bar Z, and a veiled girl walking down State Street. The trio's odd appearance prompted her to call police, insisting that the girl could be Elizabeth Smart. Responding officers quickly located the group and asked for identification. Mitchell claimed to be a traveling minister with his 2 wives. When pressed, Elizabeth hesitated, but eventually confirmed her identity. What emerged after her rescue was a troubling portrait of missed warning signs. Several members of the public had encountered Mitchell and Elizabeth, but without knowledge of the case's nuances, they failed to connect the dots. Even some law enforcement interactions during their time in California had failed to pierce through the veil of Mitchell's deceptions. The effectiveness of Mitchell's disguise strategy, combined with Elizabeth's fear and strict instructions to remain silent, had created a nearly impenetrable shield. Each missed opportunity underscored the need for greater training, awareness, and urgency in handling suspicious behavior, particularly when potential victims are hidden in plain sight. In the end, it was the persistence of the Smart family, the memory of a young girl, and the vigilance of a concerned citizen that finally broke the cycle. But until that moment, Elizabeth had come heartbreakingly close to being seen and overlooked. On March 12, 2003, after 277 days in captivity, Elizabeth Smart was rescued in Sandy, Utah. just 18 miles from her family's home. The breakthrough began with a tip from a couple who had seen a recently released police sketch of Emmanuel, the man now identified as Brian David Mitchell. They recognized him from local sightings and reported seeing him traveling with two women, one heavily veiled. That morning, Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth had been walking along State Street when Sandy police officers received the tip. Responding quickly, they located the trio near a strip mall. Mitchell, dressed in a long robe and carrying a walking stick, continued to claim he was a religious preacher named Emmanuel. Barzee, quiet and distant, said little. The third figure, a veiled girl, was identified by police as the focus of their attention. Officers separated the three and began questioning them individually. Mitchell was evasive. Nicole Brown was born on May 19, 1959, in Frankfurt, West Germany, to Juditha Ann and Louis Hezekiel Brown. Her father was an American working in Germany, and her mother was German. The family relocated to the United States when Nicole was a child, eventually settling in Southern California. Nicole attended Dana Hills High School in Dana Point, and later worked at a Beverly Hills club called Daisy, a popular venue frequented by celebrities. It was there, in 1977, that Nicole Brown met O.J. Simpson. At the time, Simpson was still married to his first wife, Marguerite Whitley, with whom he had 3 children, including a daughter who had passed away in a tragic swimming pool accident earlier that decade. Simpson, a former NFL star and 1968 Heisman Trophy winner, had become a prominent media figure and actor by the late 1970s. The relationship between Simpson and Brown developed quickly. After his divorce in 1979, Simpson and Brown became inseparable. Nicole and O.J. lived together for several years before marrying on February 2nd, 1985. They had 2 children, Sydney Brooke Simpson, born in 1985, and Justin Ryan Simpson, born in 1988. During the early years of their marriage, they resided in a mansion in the affluent Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. Publicly, the couple often appeared at events together and were photographed smiling, embodying the image of a glamorous, successful family. However, friends and family would later testify that the marriage was marred by recurring domestic abuse. Nicole had confided in close friends about controlling behavior and physical violence. These concerns were largely kept out of the public eye at the time. According to police records, the Los Angeles Police Department responded to multiple calls related to domestic disturbances at their home during the 1980s. One particularly well-documented incident occurred on New Year's Day, 1989, when Nicole dialed 911, reporting that Simpson had hit her. Police found her visibly bruised and distraught. A photograph taken at the scene reportedly showed injuries consistent with her statements. Simpson was arrested but ultimately pleaded no contest to spousal battery. He was sentenced to community service, probation, and ordered to attend counseling. Despite these incidents, Nicole remained in the marriage for several more years. She later stated to friends that she feared for her life, but also felt pressure due to the children and public attention. Her diary, later introduced in court proceedings, included references to multiple incidents of abuse, including descriptions of fear and psychological control. By the early 1990s, Nicole began to reassert her independence. In 1992, she filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The divorce was finalized in October of that year. Despite the separation, the relationship between Simpson and Brown remained tumultuous. They continued to see each other off and on, with periods of reconciliation followed by renewed tension. According to testimonies and phone records, Simpson frequently monitored Nicole's whereabouts and expressed jealousy over her dating life. Several friends and associates noted that Simpson would appear uninvited at Nicole's home or at restaurants where she was dining. Nicole moved into a townhouse on Bundy Drive in Brentwood, while Simpson continued to live nearby. By mid-1994, Nicole had largely moved on from the relationship. Friends later testified that she was focused on raising her children and maintaining a healthy lifestyle. She frequently exercised, took cooking classes, and participated in her children's school activities. Still, the undercurrent of tension with Simpson reportedly persisted. On June 12, 1994, Nicole spent the day attending her daughter, Sydney's dance recital. That evening, she went to dinner at the Mezzaluna Trattoria in Brentwood with her family and children. Ron Goldman, a waiter at the restaurant and a casual acquaintance of Nicole's, worked that night. What followed in the late hours of that Sunday would lead to one of the most infamous murder investigations in American history. The marriage between Nicole Brown Simpson and O.J. Simpson had long been shadowed by violence. Though outwardly the couple maintained the image of a successful family, private documentation and witness accounts later revealed a troubling pattern of physical and emotional abuse throughout their relationship. According to LAPD records and court documents, police responded to at least 8 domestic disturbance calls between 1984 and 1989. These incidents, while known to authorities, rarely resulted in legal consequences for Simpson. Reports indicate that Nicole repeatedly downplayed the severity of the abuse during initial police interactions, a behavior consistent with many domestic violence victims. Friends later stated she feared retaliation and was reluctant to take legal action. The most publicized incident occurred on January 1st, 1989. Nicole placed a frantic 911 call, reporting that O.J. had struck her. When officers arrived, they found her visibly battered. The responding officers documented bruises and swelling. A photo of Nicole, showing a cut lip and blackened eye, was taken as evidence. Despite the severity of the injuries, Simpson was not arrested at the scene. Instead, he was later charged and ultimately pleaded no contest to 1 count of spousal battery. He received probation, a fine, and was required to attend counseling. In a letter Nicole later wrote, and which was presented during trial proceedings, she described living in fear. "I'm scared of you. You're capable of great rage." Her diary entries, admitted as evidence in the civil trial, recounted multiple instances of violence, including threats, jealous outbursts, and physical assaults. In one entry, she recounted hiding in a closet with her children while Simpson yelled and pounded on the door. Statements from friends and associates supported Nicole's claims. Kris Jenner, a close friend, said Nicole had spoken candidly about the abuse, sometimes showing visible injuries. Another friend, Faye Resnick, described how Nicole feared for her life and had begun documenting the abuse in case something happened to her. Family members also observed the decline in Nicole's mental and emotional state. Her sisters, Denise and Dominique Brown, testified that Nicole had become increasingly anxious and withdrawn in the years leading up to her death. Denise recalled receiving calls from Nicole during fights with Simpson, sometimes hearing the sounds of struggle in the background. Despite these alarms, Simpson remained a beloved figure in the public eye, often seen as charming and charismatic. The legal response to the abuse was limited. Although Simpson had been ordered to undergo counseling, records show he did not consistently comply with the court's directives. Nicole's attempts to sever ties following their 1992 divorce were met with intermittent reconciliation and renewed intimidation. In a 1993 police call, Nicole again reported being threatened by Simpson, but no charges were filed. Nicole made efforts to protect herself. She consulted with attorneys about restraining orders and discussed moving away from Los Angeles. In the months leading up to her death, she told friends she believed Simpson was stalking her. She noticed his vehicle parked near her residence and received phone calls from unlisted numbers. These claims were supported during later investigations, including testimony that Simpson had used a private investigator to monitor her activities. Despite her fears, Nicole maintained a public life focused on her children. She took classes, exercised regularly, and socialized with a tight-knit group of friends. Still, the underlying fear remained. A therapist she saw in 1993 noted that she exhibited signs of trauma consistent with long-term abuse. In May 1994, just weeks before her death, Nicole called a battered women's shelter hotline. The transcript of the call, later cited in legal documents, included a statement where she said she feared being killed. It was not the first time she'd expressed such concerns, but it would tragically be one of the last. By June 1994, Nicole had largely disengaged from any romantic involvement with Simpson. Friends said she was trying to create a stable life for her children and minimize contact with him. Yet the threat she sensed, the fear she documented in letters and diaries, would soon be realized. Nicole Brown Simpson officially filed for divorce from O.J. Simpson in February 1992, citing irreconcilable differences. The decision followed over a decade of a turbulent relationship marked by documented episodes of domestic violence. The divorce was finalized in October of that year. While the legal proceedings ended their marriage on paper, the emotional and personal entanglement between Nicole and Simpson continued for the next 2 years. Following the divorce, Nicole sought to build a life separate from Simpson. She retained custody of their 2 children, Sydney and Justin, and moved into a 3-bedroom townhouse at 875 South Bundy Drive in the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. The residence was modest by comparison to Simpson's Rockingham estate, but was located nearby to allow continued access for their children. Nicole attempted to reclaim her independence through parenting, self-improvement, and personal development. She took interior design courses and cooking classes and maintained a regular fitness routine. Friends noted a visible change in her demeanor. She was focused, more assertive, and increasingly confident. She frequently organized playdates, school events, and family dinners, immersing herself in her children's lives. Yet, despite her efforts, Simpson remained a recurring presence. Friends reported that he continued to visit her, uninvited, and monitored her social life. On some occasions, he was reportedly enraged by her dating others. According to witnesses, Simpson once appeared at a restaurant where Nicole was dining with friends and created a scene. In another instance, Nicole's friend Cora Fishman testified that Simpson watched the house and once entered unannounced, confronting Nicole about her private life. Court records later revealed that Nicole documented these intrusions. In a safety deposit box, she stored photographs, diary entries, and letters chronicling her fear of Simpson. These materials were later presented as evidence during the civil trial. In one diary excerpt, Nicole wrote, "I'm scared. He's watching me. I can't go anywhere without looking over my shoulder." Despite their fraught post-divorce dynamic, there were periods of reconciliation. In late 1992 and into 1993, Nicole and Simpson briefly resumed their relationship. These reunions, according to family members, were marked by initial calm, followed by renewed arguments and emotional volatility. Nicole's sister, Denise Brown, testified that these cycles were common. Hopeful beginnings, followed by disappointment and renewed fear. By mid-1993, Nicole ended the reconciliation. She told friends she no longer trusted Simpson and that any emotional attachment was outweighed by concern for her safety. That fall, she retained a new attorney and discussed legal measures to restrict Simpson's contact. Although she considered a restraining order, she ultimately did not pursue one. Friends believed she feared the backlash such an action might provoke. Nicole's attempts to date new people were met with hostility from Simpson. Several friends testified that Simpson harassed or intimidated men he believed were involved with Nicole. Ron Shipp, a former LAPD officer and friend to both Nicole and Simpson, later testified that Simpson had become obsessive, saying he had disturbing conversations about what Nicole was doing and who she was seeing. On one occasion, Shipp said Simpson told him, "I just want to know who she's sleeping with." Meanwhile, Nicole continued to build a network of support. She maintained close relationships with her family, including her mother, Juditha, father Lou, and her sisters. They often gathered for dinners and holidays, and Nicole regularly vacationed with them. In early 1994, she joined a gym, deepened friendships with other mothers from her children's school, and took on more volunteer work. Still, the tension persisted. Nicole once confided to a friend that she feared, "He's going to kill me and get away with it." These sentiments were not uncommon among her confidants, many of whom expressed frustration that Simpson's fame seemed to shield him from scrutiny. In May 1994, Nicole called 911 after a confrontation with Simpson outside her townhouse. According to the dispatcher's notes, Nicole reported that Simpson was yelling and refusing to leave. No arrest was made. Weeks later, she reportedly told friends she was considering leaving Los Angeles permanently to protect her children and escape the environment of fear. On June 12, 1994, Nicole attended her daughter Sydney's dance recital at Paul Revere Middle School. O.J. Simpson was also present, and they reportedly exchanged brief pleasantries. That evening, Nicole dined with her children, her parents, and other family members at Mezzaluna, a nearby Italian restaurant. After dinner, she returned home with her children. Later that night, Nicole and Ron Goldman were found stabbed to death outside her townhouse. June 12, 1994, began as an ordinary day for Nicole Brown Simpson. That Sunday afternoon, she attended a recital for her daughter Sydney at Paul Revere Middle School in Pacific Palisades. O.J. Simpson also attended, and while they were seated separately, they exchanged civil remarks. After the recital, Nicole returned to her Brentwood townhouse on South Bundy Drive. Later that evening, at approximately 6 p.m., Nicole, her children, and family members, including her mother, Juditha Brown, dined at Mezzaluna Trattoria, a local Italian restaurant on San Vicente Boulevard. Ron Goldman, a 25-year-old waiter and acquaintance of Nicole's, worked at the restaurant that night. Nicole's mother accidentally left behind her eyeglasses, which Goldman offered to return after his shift ended. According to restaurant manager records and testimony, Goldman left Mezzaluna around 9:45 p.m. carrying the glasses in a white envelope. At this time, Nicole was home with her children, who were preparing for bed. Her last known phone call was made at 9:40 p.m., a conversation with a friend. At around 10:15 p.m., neighbors heard a dog barking repeatedly near Nicole's residence. One witness, Pablo Fenves, who lived nearby, reported hearing the cries of a dog beginning around 10:15 and continuing for some time. Another neighbor, Stephen Schwab, found Nicole's Akita wandering alone with blood on its paws and leash. He walked the dog around the neighborhood, eventually arriving at the home of Sucru Bostepe and his wife. Neighbors of Nicole at around 11:30 p.m. They recognized the dog and, concerned, walked it back to Nicole's residence. At approximately 12:10 a.m. on June 13th, the Bozteps discovered the bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman at the foot of a walkway leading to Nicole's front door. They called the police immediately. The first officer on scene, Robert Risks of the LAPD, arrived shortly after 12:15 a.m. He found Nicole's body lying face down in a pool of blood at the bottom of the stairs, barefoot and wearing a black dress. Her body had multiple deep wounds, including a fatal cut to the neck that nearly decapitated her. Near her, Goldman's body lay amid upturned plant pots and signs of a struggle. He had been stabbed multiple times in the neck, chest, and abdomen, and had defensive wounds on his hands. Riska secured the crime scene and called for backup. Detectives Tom Lange and Philip Van Adder were notified and took charge of the investigation. They observed a trail of bloody footprints leaving the scene, consistent with a size 12 Bruno Magli shoe. No wallet, cash, or jewelry had been taken from either victim, ruling out robbery as a primary motive. Meanwhile, officers attempted to notify next of kin. Upon learning that Nicole's ex-husband lived nearby at 360 North Rockingham Avenue, 4 detectives, Lange, Van Atter, Ron Phillips, and Mark Furman, proceeded to Simpson's residence. It was now approximately 4:30 a.m. on June 13th. They found Simpson's white Ford Bronco parked outside at an odd angle. Detectives noticed what appeared to be bloodstains on the driver's side door and a red smear on the interior handle. The officers knocked on the front door, but received no answer. The housekeeper, Cato Kalin, who had been staying in the guest house, emerged and provided information about Simpson's travel schedule. He stated that Simpson had taken a red-eye flight to Chicago late the previous evening. Kalin also described hearing loud thumps on the back wall of his room around 10:40 p.m., but did not investigate. Given the circumstances, the detectives decided to enter the property without a warrant, citing concern for Simpson's safety. Inside the premises, they discovered blood drops in the entryway and a glove behind Kalin's guest house. Later, forensic testing matched this glove to one found at the crime scene. Simpson was contacted in Chicago by police at approximately 6 a.m. and informed of Nicole's death. He returned to Los Angeles on a flight arranged by his attorneys, arriving at LAX in the early afternoon of June 13th. Detectives met him at the airport, where they noted a small cut on his left hand. Simpson claimed he had injured it while breaking a glass in his hotel room after learning of Nicole's death. That evening, police obtained a search warrant for Simpson's Rockingham estate and collected evidence, including blood samples, clothing, and the other glove. A bloody sock found in his bedroom later tested positive for both Simpson's and Nicole's blood. Ron Goldman's connection to Nicole was limited. Friends confirmed they were friendly, but not romantically involved. Goldman had offered to return Juditha Brown's forgotten glasses as a favor. The coroner later estimated the time of death for both victims to be between 10:15 and 10:40 p.m., coinciding with when neighbors heard the dog barking and Kalin heard noises behind his guest house. The double homicide investigation had begun. Within days, suspicion turned toward O.J. Simpson. The crime scene at 875 South Bundy Drive, where the bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were discovered, became the focal point of one of the most scrutinized investigations in American legal history. LAPD officers arrived at the location shortly after 12:15 a.m. on June 13th, 1994. Officer Robert Riska was first on scene, quickly confirming the presence of 2 deceased individuals and securing the area for detectives. Nicole Brown Simpson was found lying in a fetal position near the front steps, face down in a pool of blood. She had been stabbed multiple times, with the fatal injury being a deep slash across the neck that severed both carotid arteries and her windpipe. Ronald Goldman's body was nearby, in a more upright position, with clear signs of defensive wounds on his hands and arms. He had suffered over 20 stab wounds, including deep punctures to the chest and neck. Crime scene investigators documented blood evidence, shoe prints, and a pair of leather gloves, one near Nicole's body and one behind the guest house of Simpson's Rockingham estate. The prints near the bodies were consistent with a size 12 Bruno Magli shoe, a rare and expensive brand. Police noted no signs of forced entry, and valuables were untouched, suggesting the crime was not a robbery. While forensic units worked through the night to collect evidence at Bundy, a parallel investigation unfolded at O.J. Simpson's home. Officers noted blood droplets on the driveway and at the entrance, a trail leading into the house, and smeared blood on the inside of Simpson's Ford Bronco, parked haphazardly on the street. The vehicle's interior revealed blood traces on the console, steering wheel, and carpet. A preliminary search of the master bedroom uncovered a pair of blood-stained socks on the floor. Detective Mark Furman discovered a second leather glove behind the guest house. The glove, brown leather and size XL, matched the one at the crime scene. Forensic tests later indicated that the gloves contained DNA from Simpson, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ronald Goldman. Blood evidence on the socks found in Simpson's bedroom also matched the DNA of Nicole. As dawn broke on June 13th, Los Angeles County Coroner Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavajiswaran conducted autopsies. Nicole had 7 stab wounds to the neck and scalp, with the fatal wound slicing from left to right, nearly decapitating her. Her hands showed minimal defensive injuries, suggesting she was subdued quickly. Goldman's body told a different story. Numerous defensive wounds on his hands and arms indicated he fought the assailant. Back at Rockingham, Cato Kalin told police he had heard loud thumps on the wall of his guest house around 10:40 p.m., but did not investigate. Police later found blood drops near the location of the glove and around the rear gate of Simpson's property. On June 14th, LAPD publicly named O.J. Simpson as a person of interest. He voluntarily submitted to questioning for approximately 3 hours that same day, accompanied by attorney Howard Weitzman. During the interview, Simpson gave a vague account of his whereabouts on the night of June 12th. He stated he had been packing for a trip to Chicago, practicing golf swings in his yard, and taking a shower. He could not account precisely for his movements during the critical period between 9:30 and 11 p.m. Forensic teams gathered evidence from multiple locations. Hair fibers consistent with Simpson's were found on Goldman's clothing. Blood drops leading from the crime scene match Simpson's DNA. Simpson had a cut on his left hand, which he attributed to an accident with a glass in a Chicago hotel room, although he provided inconsistent versions of how the injury occurred. The LAPD's crime lab, led by criminalist Dennis Fung, cataloged the evidence, including hair, fibers, footprints, blood samples, and gloves. In subsequent months, DNA testing performed by Cellmark Diagnostics and the FBI confirmed the presence of Simpson's blood at the crime scene, in his Bronco, and at his home. The probability of the blood evidence matching anyone other than Simpson was calculated at over 1 in a billion. Media interest in the case grew rapidly. News outlets reported live from both crime scenes. By June 15th, helicopters hovered over Simpson's estate, and national news programs carried updates hourly. Public opinion was divided early, But Simpson remained out of custody and retained a high-profile legal team. On June 17th, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office filed charges against Simpson for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. A warrant was issued for his arrest. But when officers arrived to take him into custody, O.J. Simpson was gone. On the morning of June 17, 1994, O.J. Simpson was scheduled to surrender to authorities at the Los Angeles Police Department's Parker Center at 11 a.m., in accordance with the arrest warrant issued the previous evening. The Los Angeles District Attorney had formally charged Simpson with the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman based on the mounting forensic and circumstantial evidence. However, when the LAPD arrived at Simpson's Brentwood home to escort him into custody, he was missing. Simpson's attorney, Robert Shapiro, informed authorities that Simpson had left his home in a white 1993 Ford Bronco, driven by Ole A.C. Cowlings, a former NFL teammate and longtime friend. The disappearance sparked immediate concern and prompted LAPD Commander David Gaskin to hold a press conference declaring Simpson a fugitive. In a highly publicized statement, LAPD Chief Willie L. Williams announced, "Mr. Simpson is a fugitive of justice and should be considered armed and dangerous." Inside the Bronco, Simpson reportedly carried a passport, a fake goatee and mustache, a large amount of cash, and a revolver. In a letter left behind at his estate and read by attorney Robert Kardashian during a televised press briefing, Simpson professed his innocence, thanked supporters, and included what some interpreted as a suicide note. The public's anxiety heightened as speculation grew over Simpson's mental state. At approximately 5:51 p.m., motorists on the Interstate 5 freeway near Orange County reported seeing the white Bronco traveling north, with Simpson reportedly in the back seat and Cowlings at the wheel. California Highway Patrol units quickly began trailing the vehicle, initiating a pursuit that soon extended into Los Angeles County. What followed became one of the most surreal media events in U.S. history. Television networks interrupted scheduled programming to broadcast the chase live. As police cruisers trailed the vehicle at low speeds, helicopters captured footage from above. By 6 p.m., nearly every major network was airing the pursuit. An estimated 95 million people watched the event unfold in real time. The chase proceeded along the 91 and 405 freeways, with Cowlings refusing to pull over. He reportedly called 911 from his car phone, warning police that Simpson had a gun to his own head and threatened suicide if they intervened. The dispatcher's recording captured Cowlings saying, "You've got to back off. He's got a gun to his head." Simpson's family and friends pleaded for him to surrender. Onlookers gathered on overpasses, holding signs of support or waving at the convoy as it passed. Spectators chanted, "Go, Juice, go," referencing Simpson's football nickname. The bizarre juxtaposition of a potential suicide standoff and the celebratory roadside atmosphere became emblematic of the media-saturated spectacle the case had become. Around 7:57 p.m., after nearly 2 hours of slow pursuit, the Bronco pulled into the driveway of Simpson's Rockingham estate. Police quickly surrounded the vehicle. Negotiations ensued for almost 45 minutes as officers attempted to coax Simpson from the car without escalating the situation. Eventually, Simpson exited the vehicle, clutching photographs of his children, and surrendered peacefully at 8:50 p.m. Simpson was taken into custody and transported to the Parker Center Jail in downtown Los Angeles. He was booked at 9:37 p.m. and held without bail. Photographs taken at the time showed him with a weary expression, wearing a white golf shirt. His mugshot would become one of the most widely circulated images of the 1990s. Inside the Bronco, police recovered a .357 Magnum revolver, a driver's license, Simpson's passport, a change of clothes, water, and approximately $8,750 in cash. These items raised questions about whether Simpson intended to flee the country or take his own life. Cowlings was arrested but later released without charges. The chase had a profound impact on public opinion. Some viewed it as a guilty man's attempt to evade justice. Others saw it as the desperate actions of an emotionally broken individual. News organizations scrambled to cover the spectacle, with several anchors and commentators speculating on Simpson's fate in real time. The combination of celebrity, alleged violence, and live television produced an unprecedented convergence of crime and entertainment. Overnight, Simpson went from accused killer to the most visible criminal defendant in America. The legal proceedings were only beginning, but the Bronco chase had already cemented its place in American cultural history. For prosecutors, the flight was a potential sign of guilt. For the defense, it was the response of a devastated man wrongly accused. Simpson's arrest marked the end of the search, but the beginning of a legal odyssey. He was arraigned on June 20th, 1994, in Los Angeles County Superior Court. At his first court appearance, Simpson declared, "Absolutely, 100% not guilty." The judge denied bail and set a preliminary hearing date. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered, divided in their opinions but united in fascination. The Bronco chase, broadcast worldwide, had transformed the case from a local double homicide into a national obsession. In the days following O.J. Simpson's dramatic arrest, legal preparations for what would become known as the trial of the century commenced. Prosecutors and defense attorneys began assembling their strategies for a case that would unfold under unprecedented media scrutiny. On June 20th, 1994, Simpson was arraigned in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Judge Kathleen Kennedy Powell presided over the hearing, during which Simpson formally entered a plea of not guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution team was led by Los Angeles County District Attorney Gil Garcetti, with Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden as lead trial attorneys. Clark, a veteran prosecutor known for her work on domestic violence cases, would soon become a national figure. Simpson's defense assembled what the media soon dubbed the Dream Team. His primary attorney was Robert Shapiro, a criminal defense lawyer with extensive experience in high-profile cases. Also on the team were Johnny Cochran, known for his courtroom flair and advocacy in police misconduct cases, F. Lee Bailey, famed for his cross-examination skills, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, experts in forensic evidence, and Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard law professor and appellate specialist. Robert Kardashian, a longtime friend of Simpson, also reactivated his legal license to join the defense team in a supporting role. From the outset, both sides faced enormous pressure. The prosecution believed the case against Simpson was strong, built on DNA evidence, a timeline linking him to the crime, and Simpson's history of domestic violence. The defense countered with a strategy focused on procedural errors, racial bias within the LAPD, and raising doubts about the integrity of forensic evidence. Meanwhile, the media descended. News vans surrounded the courthouse, and television networks launched daily coverage. CNN, Court TV, and the major broadcast stations devoted extensive airtime to every development. Tabloids competed for exclusive photos, leaked documents, and interviews with anyone connected to the case. The Los Angeles Times, New York Times, and other major newspapers ran front-page stories regularly. cable news shows discussed the case nightly, turning attorneys, witnesses, and even jurors into public figures. One of the earliest challenges involved jury selection. Over 1,000 prospective jurors were summoned. The process, known as voir dire, was unusually complex due to the case's visibility and racial dynamics. Simpson, a black celebrity with a largely white fan base, faced charges for killing Nicole, a white woman, and Goldman, also white. The racial composition of the jury and its potential biases became a central concern. After weeks of screening, a 12-person jury was selected, 8 women and 4 men, including 9 African Americans, 2 whites, and 1 Hispanic juror. 12 alternates were also chosen. The jurors were sequestered, housed in a hotel, forbidden from watching television or reading news coverage, and closely monitored to prevent outside influence. This seclusion would last for nearly 9 months. Simultaneously, pretrial motions were argued in court. The defense sought to suppress key pieces of evidence, including DNA samples, the gloves, and details about Simpson's prior domestic violence. Prosecutors fought to have those same elements admitted, arguing they were essential to establishing motive and identity. Judge Lance Ito, a former prosecutor and appointed Superior Court judge, was assigned to oversee the trial. Ito allowed television cameras in the courtroom, a controversial decision that transformed the proceedings into a public spectacle. The trial, originally expected to last a few months, would stretch into nearly a full year. The prosecution emphasized a narrative of escalating domestic abuse culminating in murder. They filed a motion to include testimony from witnesses about Simpson's prior acts of violence toward Nicole. Clark argued that the history of abuse was directly relevant to the motive. Judge Ito eventually allowed limited testimony on past abuse, framing it within the context of establishing intent. The defense developed a strategy centered on police misconduct and evidence contamination. Scheck and Neufeld focused on attacking the credibility of the LAPD's forensic procedures. Cochran began to craft a broader argument that Simpson was being framed by racist officers within a corrupt system. As legal teams prepared, Simpson remained incarcerated at the Men's Central Jail in Los Angeles. Despite the isolation, he continued to communicate with his defense team daily. He maintained his innocence in interviews, statements, and conversations with family. The jailhouse phone records showed frequent contact with his legal team and his children. On January 24, 1995, the trial officially began with opening statements. Millions tuned in live. From the outset, the courtroom became theater, with every word dissected by legal analysts and commentators. The stakes were high, and both sides knew that the courtroom was only one battlefield. The court of public opinion loomed just as large. The people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson commenced on January 24, 1995, in Department 103 of the Los Angeles County Superior Court. With millions watching live on television, the prosecution and defense delivered their opening statements, laying out competing narratives in one of the most highly anticipated trials in U.S. history. Deputy District Attorney Marcia Clark began by presenting the prosecution's case. She described a pattern of abuse that culminated in murder, asserting that O.J. Simpson had a long history of domestic violence against Nicole Brown Simpson. Clark outlined the timeline of June 12, 1994, connecting Simpson to the crime scene through forensic evidence, blood, hair, fibers, and the gloves. She promised the jury that scientific evidence would paint a picture clearer than any eyewitness could. Co-counsel Christopher Darden reinforced this argument, highlighting Simpson's control and jealousy. Darden told jurors that Nicole was slaughtered and that the motive was rooted in Simpson's inability to accept the end of their relationship. In response, defense attorney Johnny Cochran delivered a powerful and theatrical opening. He denied that Simpson had any involvement in the killings and introduced the central theme of the defense: police misconduct and systemic racism. Cochran stated, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," previewing a phrase that would become synonymous with the case. He argued that the LAPD had rushed to judgment and mishandled evidence, citing Detective Mark Furman as a key figure in the alleged frame-up. The first witnesses were family members and friends of Nicole Brown Simpson, who testified about her relationship with Simpson and instances of abuse. Denise Brown, Nicole's sister, emotionally recounted seeing bruises and hearing Nicole's fear that Simpson would kill her someday. Her testimony helped establish a pattern of abuse central to the prosecution's case. Testimony then turned to the crime scene. LAPD officers, including Robert Riske and Detective Tom Lang, described their observations at Bundy Drive. They detailed the positioning of the bodies, the presence of blood, and the trail of evidence leading away from the scene. Criminalist Dennis Fung, responsible for collecting much of the forensic evidence, testified about his procedures. The defense seized on his admissions of procedural errors, such as failure to change gloves between samples and delays in evidence packaging, as indications of possible contamination or manipulation. Attention soon shifted to O.J. Simpson's Bronco. Police testified that blood from both victims was found inside the vehicle. Additional testimony indicated Simpson's blood was at the crime scene and on a glove found behind his guest house. The defense challenged the integrity of the DNA collection and testing, suggesting sloppy police work and laboratory contamination. Jurors were also presented with an extensive timeline of Simpson's movements. The prosecution used phone records, limo driver testimony, and airport security footage to argue that Simpson had enough time to commit the murders and still make his flight to Chicago. Alan Park, the limousine driver hired to take Simpson to the airport on the night of the murders, testified that Simpson did not answer the intercom when he first arrived and only emerged minutes before departure, claiming he had overslept. One of the most dramatic moments in the early phase of the trial was the introduction of the gloves. Prosecutors argued that one glove was found at the crime scene and the other at Simpson's residence. In a courtroom demonstration, they asked Simpson to try them on. With latex gloves underneath, Simpson appeared to struggle as he attempted to put on the leather gloves, stating, "They're too small." This visual became a defining moment. The defense argued the gloves did not fit, reinforcing their refrain: "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." Prosecutors later explained that the gloves had shrunk due to moisture and had latex barriers beneath them. Nonetheless, the image of Simpson apparently unable to wear the gloves cast doubt for some jurors. The media reported every twist in real time. Legal analysts on CNN, Court TV, and network news programs dissected each witness and piece of evidence. Public opinion was divided along racial and cultural lines, with polls revealing that reactions to testimony often differed sharply based on race and geography. Despite the intensity of the proceedings, the trial maintained a steady pace through the first several weeks. By spring, over 40 witnesses had testified. The prosecution relied on a mountain of forensic evidence: blood, hair, fibers, shoe prints, but faced persistent challenges from the defense, who emphasized errors in collection, testing, and chain of custody. With each day, the courtroom increasingly reflected a collision of law, celebrity, race, and media. The case was no longer just about two brutal murders. It had become a national referendum on policing, justice, and truth in the spotlight of celebrity. As the trial progressed into spring 1995, the prosecution leaned heavily on forensic evidence to tie O.J. Simpson to the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Deputy District Attorney Marcia Clark described the evidence as a trail of blood from Bundy Drive to Simpson's Rockingham estate. The prosecution introduced over 100 exhibits related to DNA, blood spatter, hair, fibers, and shoe prints. Dr. Robin Cotton of Cellmark Diagnostics and FBI analyst Roger Martz were among the key forensic witnesses. They testified that blood found at the crime scene matched Simpson's genetic profile with a probability of 1 in 170 million. Blood drops on the walkway at Bundy Drive, the interior of Simpson's Bronco. And the glove found behind his guest house also contained a mix of DNA from Simpson, Nicole, and Goldman. Cotton stated that the chance of the DNA belonging to someone other than Simpson was less than 1 in 21 billion. Additional evidence included a pair of size 12 Bruno Magli shoe prints found in the blood at the crime scene. The soles matched a rare model. Only 299 pairs were sold in the U.S. The prosecution contended that Simpson owned such shoes, though no photos or the shoes themselves were ever found. A key photograph, later submitted during the civil trial, appeared to show Simpson wearing Bruno Magli shoes at a 1993 event, but this was not available during the criminal proceedings. Hair and fiber evidence also supported the prosecution's case. Blonde hairs found on Simpson's clothing were consistent with Nicole's. Carpet fibers from the Bronco matched those found on Goldman's clothes. Dark hairs similar to Simpson's were found on Goldman's shirt. However, the defense challenged the significance of these findings, arguing that they could be explained by secondary transfer or were not conclusive proof. Central to the defense's strategy was attacking the reliability of the forensic collection and the credibility of the investigators. They highlighted mishandling of evidence, including LAPD criminalist Dennis Fung's failure to change gloves between samples, inadequate refrigeration of blood samples, and discrepancies in evidence logs. Fung admitted under cross-examination that mistakes were made but denied any deliberate misconduct. The defense further argued that the Los Angeles Police Department had planted or manipulated evidence to frame Simpson. Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, both part of the defense team and experienced in DNA litigation, pointed to the presence of preservative EDTA, a chemical used in blood tubes, in some samples taken from Simpson's home, suggesting possible planting. The prosecution refuted this claim, citing potential contamination or laboratory error rather than deliberate tampering. Detective Mark Furman's role came under intense scrutiny. He had discovered a key piece of evidence, the left-hand glove behind Simpson's guest house. Furman testified that he had never used racist language or acted with bias. However, the defense later produced tapes in which Furman used racial slurs and spoke of falsifying evidence. These revelations severely damaged his credibility. Furman invoked the Fifth Amendment when asked on the stand whether he had planted evidence in the Simpson case. The glove demonstration in court, where Simpson struggled to fit on the gloves found at the crime scene and at his home, remained a turning point. The defense seized the moment, arguing the gloves didn't belong to Simpson. Prosecutors countered that the gloves had shrunk from exposure to blood and moisture, and that Simpson wore latex gloves underneath during the demonstration, affecting the fit. Nevertheless, the visual impact favored the defense. The cumulative effect of the forensic challenges was significant. While the scientific evidence linked Simpson to the crime, the defense had succeeded in raising doubts about how the evidence was gathered, handled, and presented. The burden of proof remained with the prosecution, and the defense only needed to introduce reasonable doubt. Legal analysts noted that while the science overwhelmingly pointed towards Simpson, the perception of bias and incompetence among law enforcement and lab technicians created an atmosphere of skepticism. The jury, sequestered for months, absorbed not only the evidence but also the courtroom drama, personality clashes, and procedural disputes. By late summer, the prosecution rested its case after presenting 58 witnesses and hundreds of exhibits. The defense then began calling its own experts and witnesses to undermine the state's narrative. Testimony ranged from DNA contamination to alternate theories of the crime. While the defense did not present an alternative suspect, it argued that the investigation was tainted from the start. Simpson, who had not taken the stand in his own defense, remained stoic throughout the proceedings. His legal team insisted that the prosecution had not met the standard of proof. As the trial entered its final phase, the jurors would be tasked with weighing complex scientific data against serious allegations of police corruption and misconduct. The outcome would hinge not just on the evidence, but on whether the jury believed the system itself had been compromised. As the trial unfolded in the courtroom, it simultaneously played out across the broader stage of American society. The O.J. Simpson case became a lens through which national issues of race, police misconduct, and the criminal justice system were debated. Public opinion was deeply divided, with racial lines often marking contrasting perspectives on guilt, justice, and fairness. From early in the proceedings, defense attorney Johnny Cochran framed the case as not only about O.J. Simpson, but about systemic racism and a history of police abuse in Los Angeles. The strategy resonated in the wake of the 1991 beating of Rodney King by LAPD officers and the subsequent 1992 Los Angeles riots. Trust in the LAPD, especially among African American communities, was at a historic low. Cochran emphasized these tensions, arguing that Simpson was a victim of racial bias and that the police had rushed to judgment. The testimony of Detective Mark Furman became a flashpoint. Furman, who discovered the bloody glove on Simpson's property, initially denied under oath ever using racist slurs. However, the defense presented taped interviews in which Furman used the N-word repeatedly and spoke of falsifying evidence. The tapes, recorded between 1985 and 1994 as part of a film research project, also included inflammatory statements about brutalizing suspects and manipulating crime scenes. When recalled to the stand, Furman invoked the Fifth Amendment repeatedly, refusing to answer questions about whether he had planted or fabricated evidence in the Simpson case. The damage to the prosecution's case was immediate. Jurors later described Furman's credibility collapse as a turning point that shifted their perception of the entire LAPD investigation. Outside the courtroom, media coverage was intense and often polarized. Polls conducted by Time, Gallup, and other organizations during the trial consistently showed racial gaps in public opinion. A July 1994 Gallup poll found that 60% of white Americans believed Simpson was guilty, while only 12% of African Americans agreed. These disparities persisted throughout the trial. News programs, talk shows, and newspapers covered the trial extensively, often focusing as much on personalities and spectacle as on legal arguments. Analysts and pundits debated evidence daily. Cable networks like Court TV gained popularity, turning the trial into a televised event watched by millions. Journalists, many with legal backgrounds, became celebrities in their own right. Race was not the only factor influencing public perception. The fame of Simpson himself, a successful African-American athlete who had cultivated a mainstream image through endorsements, film roles, and broadcasting, complicated how people interpreted the allegations. To some, he symbolized the achievement of the American dream. To others, he represented a privileged figure potentially shielded from accountability. Judge Lance Ito's decision to allow cameras in the courtroom contributed to the case's visibility. The trial's participants, lawyers, witnesses, even jurors, became subjects of intense media scrutiny. Coverage extended to their attire, behavior, and personal histories. The trial was frequently satirized in television and print, illustrating its transformation into a pop culture phenomenon. Within the jury room, racial tensions were mirrored in interactions between jurors. Although the panel was composed of diverse individuals, reports from dismissed jurors and post-trial interviews indicated disagreements, mistrust, and cliques along racial and gender lines. Judge Ito dismissed multiple jurors over the course of the trial due to misconduct or failure to follow court rules. Meanwhile, Simpson's defense team highlighted the LAPD's record of misconduct and presented expert testimony criticizing forensic practices. Their argument was not that someone else committed the murders, but that the state's evidence could not be trusted. They emphasized the concept of reasonable doubt, supported by the shadow cast by Furman's perjury and the broader narrative of police racism. Prosecutors attempted to refocus the jury on the evidence: blood, DNA, and motive. Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden contended that the weight of forensic science far outweighed questions about individual officers. They warned against allowing emotion or politics to cloud objective judgment. Still, the defense's narrative had taken root. By the end of the summer, the case had become a national referendum on race, power, and the reliability of the justice system. News outlets aired nightly panels debating what the trial revealed about America. In homes, workplaces, and communities across the country, people followed the proceedings as a symbol of broader societal conflicts. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides prepared for closing arguments. The jury would not only decide the fate of O.J. Simpson, they would also render a verdict with implications far beyond the courtroom. After more than 8 months of testimony, the trial of O.J. Simpson entered its final stage in late September 1995. Both the prosecution and the defense delivered closing arguments designed to summarize months of complex testimony and influence the jury's ultimate decision. Marcia Clark opened for the prosecution on September 26th. She reviewed the timeline, forensic evidence, and history of abuse. Emphasizing the DNA evidence, she argued that Simpson left a trail of blood connecting the crime scene, his vehicle, and his home. Clark highlighted the lack of alibi for the critical time frame and the physical evidence linking Simpson to the murders, including blood matching his and the victim's DNA. "This man murdered Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman in cold blood," she stated. "The evidence tells you that." Co-prosecutor Christopher Darden followed, directing attention to the emotional aspects of the case. He described Nicole's fear of Simpson and her attempts to reclaim her life. He criticized the defense's focus on Detective Mark Furman, arguing that his misconduct did not alter the scientific facts. Darden also revisited the glove demonstration, asserting the gloves had shrunk and were stiffened by dried blood. "Evidence doesn't lie," he concluded. "People lie. The gloves didn't lie. The blood didn't lie. The fibers didn't lie." On September 28th, Johnny Cochran delivered the defense's closing. He urged jurors to consider the broader context of racial injustice and police misconduct. He stated, "We have the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country conspiring against one citizen. Cochran likened the case to civil rights struggles, calling Simpson a target of a corrupt system. In a theatrical moment, he used the glove demonstration to coin his famous line, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." Cochran alleged that Furman had planted the glove at Simpson's residence and that blood evidence had been tampered with. He painted the investigation as tainted from the outset, portraying Simpson as a victim of racial bias and systemic failure. Barry Scheck and F. Lee Bailey reinforced these points, questioning the chain of custody and reliability of the forensic work. On October 2nd, Judge Lance Ito gave final jury instructions outlining the legal standards and burden of proof. Jurors were told they must find Simpson guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and to base their verdict solely on the evidence and testimony presented during trial. At 9 a.m. on October the 3rd, 1995, the jury announced they had reached a verdict after less than 4 hours of deliberation. That afternoon, in a packed courtroom and before a national television audience, the clerk read the decision. "We, the jury, in the above entitled action find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder." Gasps and cheers erupted across the country. Simpson exhaled and mouthed, "Thank you," to the jury. Nichols and Goldman's families sat in stunned silence. Public reaction was immediate and polarized. Polls revealed that a majority of Black Americans supported the verdict, viewing it as a corrective to decades of racial bias in the justice system. In contrast, many white Americans expressed disbelief, citing the strength of the forensic evidence. News organizations broadcast reactions from around the world, underscoring the cultural and racial divides laid bare by the trial. Members of the jury later explained their decision. Several cited doubts about the integrity of the LAPD's investigation and the influence of Furman's testimony. Juror Brenda Moran stated, "We had reasonable doubt. That's all we needed." Another juror, Lionel Cryer, said, "We couldn't trust the police." Legal experts were divided. Some criticized the prosecution for failing to adapt to the defense's tactics, particularly their emphasis on race and misconduct. Others argued the trial exposed deep flaws in the justice system's ability to handle high-profile, media-saturated cases. The verdict became a defining moment in American legal and cultural history. O.J. Simpson walked free, but public debate over his guilt persisted. The Brown and Goldman families, unsatisfied with the outcome, began preparing a civil suit. For them, justice remained elusive, and the criminal trial had left questions unanswered. In the wake of O.J. Simpson's acquittal, public discourse continued to churn. The not guilty verdict did not end the legal consequences for Simpson. The families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, unsatisfied with the outcome of the criminal trial, pursued civil action. In 1995, Fred Goldman and the Brown family filed a wrongful death lawsuit in California Superior Court in Santa Monica. Unlike a criminal trial, where guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, civil cases require a lower standard, a preponderance of the evidence. This meant the jury only needed to believe it was more likely than not that Simpson had caused the deaths. The civil trial began in October 1996, presided over by Judge Hiroshi Fujisaki, who imposed tighter restrictions on media coverage. Unlike the criminal trial, cameras were banned from the courtroom. The plaintiffs were represented by Daniel Petrocelli, an attorney known for civil litigation but not criminal defense. Simpson was again represented by members of his former legal team, though Johnny Cochran did not participate. Key differences marked the civil proceedings. Simpson was compelled to testify under oath, something he had not done during the criminal trial. Over 3 days of questioning, he was pressed on his actions, timeline, and the evidence. He gave inconsistent answers about the night of June 12th, including vague explanations about his injured hand and the timeline of his movements before and after the murders. Evidence from the criminal trial was reused, including the DNA findings, blood trails, and photographs. The plaintiffs also introduced new evidence, including photos from a 1993 Buffalo Bills event showing Simpson wearing Bruno Magli shoes of the same model and size as those believed to have left prints at the crime scene. During the criminal trial, Simpson had denied owning such shoes. The civil jury was now shown multiple photographs contradicting that claim. Petrocelli's strategy centered on portraying Simpson as deceitful and controlling. He called friends, former employees, and experts to bolster the timeline and the psychological profile the plaintiffs presented. The court also allowed jurors to consider Simpson's pattern of domestic violence as a contributing factor in the events leading to the murders. Simpson's defense argued that the civil case merely recycled flawed evidence from the criminal trial. They claimed no direct evidence connected Simpson to the murders and attacked the credibility of witnesses. However, lacking the courtroom theatrics and broad racial narrative of the criminal trial, the defense had less impact. On February 4, 1997, after months of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Simpson liable for the wrongful deaths of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson. They awarded $8.5 million in compensatory damages to the Goldman family and later added $25 million in punitive damages to be divided between both families. In total, Simpson was ordered to pay $33.5 million. Simpson, who claimed financial insolvency, did not voluntarily pay the full sum. The Goldman family pursued enforcement actions, attempting to collect through seizure of assets, royalties, and future earnings. In 2006, they acquired the rights to Simpson's unpublished book, If I Did It, through bankruptcy proceedings. The book, originally intended to be a hypothetical confession, was rebranded and published with the subtitle Confessions of the Killer. The Brown family channeled their efforts into advocacy. Nicole's sister, Denise Brown, became a spokesperson against domestic violence, giving public talks and raising awareness about the warning signs Nicole had exhibited. In 1994, the Nicole Brown Charitable Foundation was established to support victims of domestic abuse. Simpson's life after the civil verdict was marked by declining finances, strained public image, and continued legal troubles. He relocated to Florida, one of the few states that shielded certain assets from civil judgments. There, he lived on a limited income, mostly derived from NFL pensions, which were legally protected from garnishment. Despite the civil judgment, Simpson continued to assert his innocence in public statements and interviews. His legal battles and notoriety persisted. In 2007, he was arrested in Las Vegas for armed robbery and kidnapping, leading to a conviction in 2008 and a 9-year prison sentence. He was released on parole in 2017. The civil trial provided a measure of accountability that many believed the criminal trial had not. For the Brown and Goldman families, it offered legal recognition of responsibility, though the emotional and financial aftermath continued for years. The public remained divided, but in the court of civil law, Simpson was found liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman and the subsequent legal proceedings left an enduring mark on American society, law, media, and culture. The case not only gripped the nation for over a year, it reshaped public conversations around domestic violence, celebrity justice, racial tension, and the limitations of forensic science in the courtroom. In the years following the verdicts, both families worked to preserve the memory of their loved ones. The Goldman family, persistent in their efforts to hold O.J. Simpson accountable, established the Ron Goldman Foundation for Justice, supporting victims' rights and advocating for civil remedies in criminal cases. The Brown family, meanwhile, became vocal advocates against domestic violence. Denise Brown, Nicole's sister, testified before Congress and campaigned to increase funding and protections for abuse victims, emphasizing early intervention and support services. Nicole's murder and the public revelations about her abusive relationship sparked widespread discourse on the signs and dangers of domestic violence. Her story was cited in national campaigns and became part of training for police and victim advocates. The 1994 Violence Against Women Act, passed shortly after her death, drew attention from lawmakers and activists who pointed to her case as evidence of systemic failure to protect victims. Nicole's name became symbolic in discussions about intimate partner violence and justice reform. The trial's televised nature had a lasting influence on media and law. Court TV, which broadcast the trial gavel to gavel, gained millions of viewers and sparked a trend in live courtroom coverage. The saturation of daily updates, analysis, and dramatization turned the legal process into entertainment and made legal commentators household names. Future high-profile trials would face similar scrutiny, from the trials of Scott Peterson to Casey Anthony. Legal education and practice also evolved. Law schools incorporated the Simpson trial into curricula, exploring its lessons on jury psychology, the power of storytelling in court, and the challenges of managing media influence. The case highlighted the importance of proper forensic protocol and chain of custody, spurring changes in evidence handling policies in law enforcement agencies nationwide. For the LAPD and the broader criminal justice system, the trial prompted internal reviews and public criticism. The exposure of Detective Mark Furman's racist language and perjury damaged the LAPD's credibility. Already fragile after the Rodney King beating, the department implemented reforms aimed at improving community relations, evidence management, and bias training, though critics argued these efforts were slow and uneven. Simpson's post-trial life was marked by legal and personal decline. The civil judgment rendered him financially constrained, and his 2007 arrest in Las Vegas on unrelated charges led to a conviction and prison sentence. Though released in 2017, he remained largely estranged from public life. His presence in popular culture persisted through documentaries, books, and dramatizations, most notably the 2016 FX miniseries The People vs. O.J. Simpson, which reignited interest in the case for a new generation. The victims, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, are remembered not only for the lives they lived, but for the roles they came to represent in broader societal debates. Nicole's name became a symbol of the overlooked victim, a woman whose repeated cries for help were inadequately addressed. Ron Goldman, a young man attempting a simple act of kindness, became emblematic of random, collateral violence. Public opinion about Simpson's guilt remained divided long after the verdicts. Polls continued to show a racial and generational split in how the case was viewed. Scholars, journalists, and legal experts continued to debate whether justice was served. What was clear, however, was that the case had reshaped the American legal landscape. The Simpson trial forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about race and justice, fame and accountability, and the ways in which institutions respond to victims. It revealed both the power and the limitations of the criminal justice system, particularly in high-profile cases. And it underscored that even overwhelming evidence may not guarantee a conviction when doubt, distrust, and narrative take hold. As of the 30th anniversary of the murders in 2024, memorials, retrospectives, and renewed calls for justice reflected the ongoing resonance of the case. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman's lives, and the questions raised by their deaths, continue to influence discussions of law, violence, and how society remembers its victims. Boulder, Colorado, was quiet under a light snowfall on December 25, 1996. The Ramsey family, John, Patsy, Burke, and 6-year-old John Benet, spent the day celebrating the holiday in their upscale home at 755 15th Street. The sprawling 7,000 square foot residence, adorned with festive decorations, was located in a well-to-do neighborhood of the university town. Inside, the family enjoyed a traditional Christmas day, reportedly hosting friends and opening gifts. John Benet, a child beauty pageant contestant known locally for her titles and public appearances, was dressed in a white outfit and had received a new bicycle that morning. By evening, the family attended a Christmas party at the White residence, family friends living nearby. Accounts indicate they left sometime after 8:30 p.m. and returned home around 9:30 or 10 p.m. Patsy put John Benet to bed shortly afterward. Burke, 9 years old, reportedly remained in his room with a Nintendo game. By all indications, the night ended uneventfully. The morning of December 26th, at approximately 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey made a frantic 911 call. She stated that her daughter was missing and that a ransom note had been found. The note, a lengthy 3-page message handwritten on a pad from inside the house, demanded $118,000 for John Benet's safe return. The amount nearly matched the bonus John had received earlier that year from his company. Police responded promptly. The first officer on the scene, Rick French, conducted an initial search of the premises, including checks of doors and windows. He did not find signs of forced entry. The Ramseys stated they had put John Benet to bed and found the ransom note early that morning on the spiral staircase. Patsy had reportedly gone downstairs to make coffee and found the note on the rear staircase leading to the kitchen. The note, addressed to Mr. Ramsey, claimed to be from a small foreign faction. It instructed the family not to contact the police or friends and warned of John Benet's execution if demands were not met. Despite the warning, the Ramseys contacted both the police and close family friends, who soon arrived and gathered at the house. As detectives arrived and began their initial inquiry, the house gradually filled with people. This, later criticized as a serious procedural error, compromised the preservation of the crime scene. Officers did not secure all rooms in the house, and visitors moved freely, including in John Benet's bedroom. Despite the note's claim of a kidnapping, John Benet's body would be discovered inside the home later that same day, under circumstances that would turn the missing persons report into a homicide investigation and launch one of the most perplexing and controversial criminal cases in American history. The morning of December 26th began in panic. At 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey called 911, reporting that her daughter, John Benet, was missing and that a ransom note had been found inside the house. Her voice, recorded on the emergency call, sounded distressed. She told the dispatcher that her daughter had been kidnapped and pleaded for help. The dispatcher advised her to stay on the line, but Patsy ended the call abruptly. Police officers arrived within minutes. Officer Rick French performed a brief initial search, including checks of doors and windows for signs of forced entry. He did not find anything out of the ordinary. John Ramsey checked John Benet's bedroom and found her bed empty, her belongings untouched. The house, a multi-level residence with numerous rooms and storage areas, was not immediately treated as a potential crime scene. This oversight would prove consequential. The ransom note, 3 pages long and handwritten on paper from a notepad within the house, was laid out on the spiral staircase. It began with, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully," and demanded $118,000, the same amount as John Ramsey's Christmas bonus. The note referenced a small foreign faction and claimed the kidnappers respected the Ramsey family's business, but opposed the U.S. government. It instructed John to withdraw the money from his bank and prepare it in specific denominations, warning him not to alert law enforcement or friends. The note stated that John Benet would be returned unharmed if the instructions were followed, but would be executed if they were not. The wording and tone of the note raised immediate suspicion. Experts later questioned its unusual length and internal inconsistencies. Despite the threat, the Ramseys contacted both police and friends shortly after discovering the note. Fleet and Priscilla White, close friends, arrived at the house along with others. Over the course of the morning, more people entered the residence, further disturbing what should have been a controlled environment. Detective Linda Arndt, the only detective on the scene for much of the morning, arrived around 8 a.m. and began interviewing the Ramseys and taking stock of the situation. She attempted to establish control over the scene, but faced difficulties due to the number of people already present. Arndt instructed the Ramseys to remain in the kitchen area and asked John to examine the house for anything unusual, focusing particularly on the basement, though her instructions on this point would later be disputed. The search for John Benet remained superficial until shortly after 1 p.m., when John Ramsey and Fleet White ventured into the basement. There, John opened a previously unchecked storage room and found his daughter's body. She was lying on her back, covered partially with a white blanket. Her hands were bound above her head, her mouth covered with duct tape, and a nylon cord was wrapped around her neck. John picked up the body and brought her upstairs, placing her on the floor near the Christmas tree. He reportedly shouted that his daughter was dead. The discovery transformed the investigation from a possible kidnapping into a homicide. Arndt noted later that upon seeing John carry the body, she felt that she was the only law enforcement officer present in the house, with no backup and a murder suspect potentially among those in the room. The scene had already been compromised, and now the recovery of John Benet's body, handled without gloves or forensic precautions, further complicated evidence collection. The day's events left the police with few reliable leads and a heavily contaminated crime scene. By early afternoon on December 26th, tensions had escalated inside the Ramsey residence. Detective Linda Arndt, still the only detective present, had attempted to manage the growing number of people in the home, but had little control over the activity. Friends and clergy came and went. The Ramseys remained in the kitchen area, visibly distraught. Meanwhile, officers waited for instructions on how to proceed, unsure whether they were dealing with a kidnapping or something more sinister. At around 1:05 p.m., Arndt suggested that John Ramsey and Fleet White search the home again from top to bottom. Though some reports suggest Arnott directed them toward the basement, her own statements later indicated she gave broad instructions to check anything unusual. Ramsey and White descended into the basement, an area not yet thoroughly searched. The basement was divided into multiple rooms, some used for storage. At the far end was a windowless, little-used room behind a latched door. John Ramsey opened the door and turned on the light. Inside, he found the body of Jean Benet. She was lying on her back on the concrete floor. A white blanket partially covered her torso. A pink nightgown lay nearby. Her mouth was sealed with duct tape, and her hands were bound above her head with a white cord. Another length of cord had been used to create a garrote around her neck, tightened with the handle of a broken paintbrush. Ramsey removed the duct tape and picked up his daughter's body. He carried her upstairs to the living room and placed her on the floor near the Christmas tree. Arndt, upon seeing the body, immediately recognized that John Benet was dead. She reported that John was highly emotional, while Patsy screamed and collapsed when she saw her daughter. The act of moving the body and the lack of protective gear caused immediate contamination of the crime scene. No forensic evidence could be gathered from the body's original location. The blanket, nightgown, and surrounding area, potentially vital sources of hair, fibers, or fingerprints, were now compromised. Although Arndt tried to preserve the scene from that point forward, significant damage had already been done. The official crime scene photos show a cord knotted tightly around John Benet's neck, with the handle of a paintbrush from Patsy's art kit used as a ligature device. The same type of cord was used to bind her wrists. Marks on her neck were consistent with strangulation, and there was a significant skull fracture. A piece of duct tape found near her body was later collected as evidence. No signs of forced entry were visible on the basement windows or doors. One window had a broken pane and a suitcase beneath it, but spider webs in the corners suggested it had not been recently used. A partially opened window led some to consider the possibility of intruder entry, though it remained speculative. The recovery of John Benet's body ended the possibility that the case was a simple kidnapping. Investigators now faced a homicide committed inside a home filled with people, including family and friends. With the crime scene severely compromised and the chain of custody broken in key areas, investigators were left with limited physical evidence and mounting pressure from the public and media. The day after John Benet Ramsey was found dead, an autopsy was conducted at the Boulder County Coroner's Office. The report, released several months later, provided critical forensic details that shaped the course of the investigation. Dr. John Meyer, the Boulder County coroner, conducted the examination. His findings revealed that John Benet had suffered a blow to the head and strangulation, both potentially fatal, with no definitive order established between the two. A deep fracture was found in the skull, extending from the front to the rear of the right side. The impact caused a linear fracture nearly 8 inches long. Despite the severity of the head trauma, there was no visible bleeding on the skin, suggesting the wound occurred while John Benet was either unconscious or already deceased. The report concluded that she had been struck with a blunt object, possibly consistent with a flashlight or similar item, although no definitive weapon was identified. The second cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation. A garrote made from white nylon cord had been tightened around her neck, and the handle of a broken paintbrush was used as a ligature tool. The cord was tied with multiple knots, and there were abrasions and deep furrows around the neck. The coroner noted that the garrote appeared to have been applied with intent and precision, suggesting premeditation or a deliberate act rather than an improvised restraint. In addition to the head wound and strangulation, the autopsy report documented injuries that raised suspicions of sexual abuse. The vaginal area showed signs of trauma, including inflammation and abrasions. While some experts argued these injuries were consistent with prior sexual contact or chronic abuse, others suggested they might have been inflicted during the assault or from the insertion of an object. A wooden paintbrush handle, believed to have been broken for use in the garrote, was also examined for possible involvement. A red mark was observed on John Benet's lower back, and a small triangular abrasion was found on her cheek. Petechial hemorrhages, tiny spots indicating bleeding, were discovered on her eyelids and the lining of her mouth, often a sign of asphyxia. The absence of defensive wounds on her arms or hands suggested that JonBenet had either been subdued or was unconscious at the time of the assault. Toxicology results showed no drugs or sedatives in her system. Stomach contents included remnants of pineapple, which became a point of interest after a bowl of pineapple was found on the kitchen table, bearing fingerprints from both Burke and Patsy. The presence of pineapple indicated JonBenet may have eaten shortly before her death, possibly contradicting statements about her going straight to bed after returning home the previous night. DNA samples were taken from JonBenet's clothing and body, including a partial male DNA profile found on her underwear. This trace, unidentified at the time, was later used to support theories involving an unknown intruder. However, the sample was too limited for conclusive identification and became a source of contention among investigators and forensic experts in the years to come. The autopsy concluded that the cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. Both injuries were fatal, but the coroner could not determine which occurred first. The findings painted a disturbing picture of violence and suggested deliberate actions, though the exact sequence remained unclear. The brutal combination of head trauma and strangulation, coupled with the forensic signs of potential sexual assault, added complexity to an already murky case. In the days following JonBenet Ramsey's death, the Boulder Police Department launched a formal homicide investigation. From the start, law enforcement faced challenges due to the mishandling of the initial crime scene. Crucial evidence had been lost or contaminated, and the timeline of events remained vague. Still, detectives moved forward, focusing early attention on the Ramsey family, largely due to inconsistencies in their accounts and the circumstances surrounding the crime. John and Patsy Ramsey were not formally interviewed on the day their daughter's body was found. Their first detailed police interviews took place several days later. Patsy's demeanor and responses drew particular interest. Investigators noted that both parents were emotional but vague in their recollections. There were discrepancies between their statements and observable evidence, such as the pineapple in the kitchen and their claims about JonBenet's bedtime. One of the most scrutinized pieces of evidence remained the ransom note. Handwriting experts analyzed the 3-page letter for style, language, and possible authorship. The note was written using a pad and pen from inside the house and contained theatrical language, with lines reminiscent of popular movies like Dirty Harry and Speed. The letter's unusual length and over-explanation were flagged as atypical for a genuine ransom demand. Multiple experts concluded that John Ramsey's handwriting did not match the note. Patsy's samples showed some similarities, but no definitive match was declared. Police attention also focused on Burke Ramsey, JonBenet's 9-year-old brother. While Burke was initially shielded from media and legal scrutiny, detectives considered the possibility that a child might have been involved, especially given the presence of the pineapple and other subtle household indicators. Burke was interviewed by a child psychologist 3 times in the weeks after the crime. Those sessions, later reviewed by investigators, revealed little outward distress but provided no clear leads. The possibility of an intruder was explored early on, but received less initial emphasis. Officers examined the broken basement window, which John Ramsey said he had broken earlier in the summer, to re-enter the home. Although a suitcase was found beneath it, and a scuff mark and debris were present, there were spider webs in the window frame, suggesting no recent passage. There were no footprints in the snow outside the house, though snowfall patterns in Boulder that night were later debated in that context. Physical evidence gathered from the scene included duct tape, the nylon cord used in the garrote, the blanket, the paintbrush pieces, and various fibers. Several latent fingerprints and palm prints were lifted from the area, but none led to confirmed suspects. A partial male DNA profile recovered from John Benet's underwear did not match any family members or anyone in criminal databases at the time. Despite the complex physical scene, law enforcement faced pressure from the public and media. Community members and reporters questioned why no arrests were made. The Ramseys, meanwhile, hired their own legal and investigative team, including high-profile attorneys and private detectives. This created tension between the Ramseys team and the Boulder police, with accusations of leaks, bias, and obstruction voiced on both sides. As weeks turned into months, divisions emerged within the investigative team. Some detectives, including lead investigator Steve Thomas, grew convinced that the evidence pointed toward the family. Others believed an outside intruder theory deserved more serious consideration. This internal conflict would persist throughout the case and influence many of the key decisions made in the years to come. In the weeks following John Benet Ramsey's death, the case drew intense national and international media attention. The juxtaposition of a child beauty queen murdered in her affluent home under mysterious circumstances proved irresistible to the press. Reporters converged on Boulder, and television segments, tabloid covers, and news columns filled with speculation, theories, and leaked details from the investigation. Photographs of John Benet in pageant costumes, makeup, and tiaras were broadcast repeatedly, reinforcing a public image that sparked debate about child beauty pageants and their cultural implications. This visual narrative, combined with the wealthy backdrop and sensational elements of the case, amplified public fascination. Critics accused the media of exploiting John Benet's image, while others believed the exposure kept pressure on authorities to solve the crime. Early leaks to the press, including the contents of the ransom note and autopsy details, came from various sources within law enforcement and the legal system. These leaks influenced public opinion and began to cast suspicion on the Ramsey family. The ransom note, widely reported to be unusually long and written with internal inconsistencies, became a focal point in discussions about Patsy Ramsey. Media outlets aired segments comparing her handwriting samples with excerpts from the note, fueling speculation of maternal involvement. As media interest peaked, the Ramseys took an unusual step. They agreed to be interviewed by CNN on January 1st, 1997, just 6 days after the murder. In the televised segment, they defended their innocence and pleaded for the real killer to come forward. This move was widely analyzed, with critics questioning the decision to speak to the media before giving full police interviews. Supporters argued that the Ramseys were being unfairly targeted without evidence. The Boulder Police Department, criticized for its early handling of the case, struggled with growing scrutiny. Internal disagreements leaked to the press, revealing a split between officers focused on the family and those open to alternative theories. The district attorney's office, led by Alex Hunter, attempted to manage the fallout by balancing investigative secrecy with public demands for answers. The Ramseys also became involved in legal conflicts with the media. They filed defamation lawsuits against several outlets and journalists, challenging reports that suggested their involvement without conclusive proof. One notable suit targeted the Star tabloid, which had published multiple sensational claims about the family. These lawsuits highlighted the tension between journalistic freedom and the rights of individuals under investigation but not charged. Meanwhile, the public absorbed an ongoing stream of contradictory information. Anonymous sources fed details to media that were later refuted. For example, reports initially claimed there were no footprints in the snow, suggesting no intruder, but later weather analyses disputed that it had snowed heavily that night. Other early stories falsely claimed that John Ramsey was not cooperative, although he provided a DNA sample and fingerprints early in the investigation. The internet, then in its early days as a news platform, played a role as well. Online message boards and forums hosted amateur sleuths dissecting every known fact of the case. Competing theories proliferated: intruder scenarios, family involvement, and even connections to other unsolved crimes. This digital discourse added to the noise, making it harder for the public, and sometimes investigators, to distinguish fact from rumor. By mid-1997, the case had become one of the most publicized unsolved homicides in modern American history. The family, now effectively under public suspicion, continued to maintain their innocence. The police investigation pressed on, but with fractured public trust and ongoing leaks undermining its credibility. For the Ramseys, public perception had already passed judgment, even as the legal system had not. As public scrutiny intensified and the investigation struggled for traction, Boulder County District Attorney Alex Hunter convened a grand jury in September 1998. After nearly 2 years of a stagnating case, Hunter's decision aimed to assess whether sufficient evidence existed to bring charges against any individual. The grand jury proceedings were secret, and its work spanned over a year, concluding in October 1999. The panel heard from dozens of witnesses, including police officers, forensic experts, handwriting analysts, and members of the Ramsey family. Grand jury access also included documents, crime scene evidence, and forensic findings. Notably, the jury reviewed information about the ransom note, the condition of John Benet's body, and the inconsistencies in the statements made by John and Patsy Ramsey. Despite speculation, the proceedings were not focused solely on the Ramseys, but also evaluated potential intruder theories. In October 1999, the grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. However, District Attorney Hunter declined to sign the indictment, stating that he did not believe there was sufficient evidence to prove the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. His decision was made public only years later, in 2013, when the indictment documents were released under court order. The unsealing of the indictment revealed that the grand jury had believed the Ramseys permitted John Benet to be placed in a situation that led to her death, and then intentionally hindered the prosecution of the person responsible. Still, no specific individual was named as the perpetrator, and the DA's refusal to prosecute remained controversial. Critics accused Hunter of political cowardice, while supporters pointed to the lack of direct evidence. Meanwhile, the Ramseys had initiated a series of defamation lawsuits against media outlets and individuals who had implicated them publicly. They sued journalists, tabloids, and even investigators, including former lead detective Steve Thomas, who had resigned from the Boulder Police Department in 1998. In his book John Benet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, Thomas criticized the district attorney's office and expressed his belief that the Ramseys were responsible. The Ramseys filed suit against him, but later settled out of court. Throughout this period, the family continued to maintain their innocence. They participated in selected interviews, published their own book titled The Death of Innocence, and worked closely with private investigators. Their legal team aggressively countered allegations and monitored media reports for potential libel. In 2000, a federal judge dismissed a defamation suit brought by the parents of a journalist's source, ruling that there was insufficient evidence to prove the Ramseys had maliciously defamed the plaintiffs. That ruling reflected the difficulty in navigating the legal complexities surrounding public figures involved in ongoing criminal investigations. Despite the lack of prosecution, the legal maneuvering highlighted the unresolved nature of the case. For the Boulder Police Department and the District Attorney's Office, the grand jury's decision and the subsequent refusal to prosecute exposed a fundamental division in the investigative approach. For the Ramseys, the grand jury developments were a double-edged sword, raising new questions about their role, even as no criminal charges were filed. As legal efforts continued, the case remained open. Yet, without formal charges or a clear suspect, momentum slowed. The legal landscape surrounding John Benet's death became as contested and convoluted as the forensic evidence itself, leaving a case both symbolically and procedurally unresolved. In the early 2000s, as forensic science advanced, renewed attention turned to the DNA evidence in the John Benet Ramsey case. Among the most significant developments was the testing of a partial male DNA profile found in John Benet's underwear, first identified in 1997. At the time, the technology available could not extract or compare the limited sample with high confidence. However, with new methods emerging, investigators hoped for a breakthrough. By 2003, trace amounts of unidentified male DNA had been detected in 2 separate places on John Benet's clothing, in her underwear and in the waistband of her long johns. The presence of the same DNA sequence in both locations strengthened the theory that it came from a single individual, not a mixture of incidental contamination. These results were considered significant by some, suggesting the presence of an unknown male at the crime scene. In 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey publicly addressed the findings. Her office had assumed control of the case from the police department in 2002 and had overseen new rounds of testing using touch DNA analysis. Based on these results, Lacey wrote a letter to John Ramsey formally exonerating the family, stating there was no reasonable basis to continue suspecting the Ramseys in John Benet's death. She acknowledged that the DNA belonged to an unknown male and called him the actual assailant. The letter represented a major shift in the official stance of the prosecution. It was the first time any authority explicitly cleared the family from suspicion. Lacey's decision drew immediate criticism from some members of law enforcement, particularly those who believed the evidence against the Ramseys, while circumstantial, remained compelling. Detractors argued that the DNA sample could have been the result of contamination during manufacturing or handling, and that clearing the family solely on that basis was premature. Critics also questioned the reliability of touch DNA analysis, a method that detects minuscule skin cells transferred through contact. The possibility of secondary transfer, where DNA is transferred from one object or person to another without direct contact, remained a concern. Some forensic experts cautioned that such results should be interpreted carefully, especially in a case with extensive evidence mishandling early on. Further complicating matters, no match for the male DNA was found in national or international databases. Despite entering the sequence into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, the sample did not correspond to any known offender. The lack of a match limited investigators' ability to pursue new suspects, even as the profile was increasingly viewed as critical. In the years following Lacey's letter, the Boulder Police Department regained control of the case. Officials announced that all evidence would be re-examined using the latest technology. Cold case specialists and outside agencies were consulted, and new lab partners were brought in for a comprehensive review. However, no conclusive leads resulted from these efforts, and the unidentified DNA remained central to the unresolved status of the case. Meanwhile, Alternative interpretations of the DNA evidence persisted. Some forensic analysts pointed out that the DNA profile might not be from the perpetrator at all, but from a factory worker or someone who handled the clothing during packaging. Others argued that the placement and duplication of the DNA across garments reduced the likelihood of incidental transfer. Despite debate over its origin, the DNA sample fundamentally altered the narrative of the investigation. It served as the foundation for officially clearing the Ramseys and redirected public and investigative attention toward the theory of an unknown intruder. Yet, without a match, the DNA alone could not bring the case to resolution. In the years following JonBenet Ramsey's death, a range of theories emerged to explain the circumstances of her murder. Despite repeated investigative efforts, no individual was ever charged. The debate split between those convinced of the Ramseys' involvement and proponents of the intruder theory, each citing conflicting interpretations of the physical evidence, behavior, and known facts. One prominent theory centered on a possible intruder who entered the house through the broken basement window. Supporters of this view noted the partially open window and a suitcase found beneath it, theorizing it could have been used as a stepping aid. Although a spiderweb in the frame appeared undisturbed, raising doubts, some argued that the web could have been rebuilt after the incident. This theory received increased attention after the 2008 DNA-based exoneration of the Ramseys. Among the suspects publicly discussed was Bill McReynolds, a family friend who had portrayed Santa Claus at a Ramsey party days before JonBenet's death. McReynolds had visited the house previously and reportedly had a fascination with JonBenet's beauty. He had also written a play about a girl being kidnapped and killed. While he cooperated fully with investigators and passed a polygraph, these details led some to question his possible involvement. However, no evidence directly linked him to the crime. Another person of interest was Gary Oliva, a convicted sex offender who lived in Boulder at the time. He was arrested in 2000 for unrelated offenses, and police discovered a photograph of JonBenet in his backpack. He had allegedly told a friend he had hurt a little girl. Though these statements were troubling, DNA tests did not match him to the unidentified profile found on JonBenet's clothing, and he was not charged. Perhaps the most widely publicized false confession came in 2006 from John Mark Carr, a former schoolteacher arrested in Thailand. Carr claimed he was with JonBenet when she died, and that her death was an accident. His confession included details that matched public information, but failed under scrutiny. DNA testing ruled him out, and he was not charged. The incident highlighted the challenges of dealing with attention seekers and false confessions in high-profile cases. The idea that JonBenet's death was accidental and covered up by a family member also persisted. Some theorists suggested Burke Ramsey may have struck his sister in a moment of anger, leading the parents to stage a kidnapping scenario. This theory was fueled by behavioral analysis, family dynamics, and inconsistencies in interviews. Yet, there was no physical evidence implicating Burke, and in 2016, he filed a defamation lawsuit against CBS for a documentary suggesting his involvement. The case was later settled confidentially. Despite years of exploration, no theory accounted for all known evidence. Some theories aligned with the forensic findings, but failed to explain the ransom note. Others explained the note's presence, but could not reconcile it with the lack of signs of forced entry or the condition of the body. The complexity of the scene, compromised from the beginning, left gaps in the timeline and physical record that may never be fully resolved. Private investigators hired by the Ramseys pursued their own leads, often focusing on the intruder theory. They examined people with past criminal records, neighbors, and local employees who might have had access to the home. Despite their efforts, no suspect emerged who could be conclusively tied to the crime through motive, means, and forensic evidence. Theories continued to circulate in books, documentaries, and online forums. Each new media project reignited public interest and introduced fresh interpretations. Some emphasized police missteps, others pointed to prosecutorial indecision, and many underscored the enduring mystery that made John Benet's case a subject of fascination for over 2 decades. Nearly 3 decades after John Benet Ramsey's death, the case remains officially unsolved. Though investigators continue to classify it as an open homicide, no arrests have been made. Over the years, the case evolved from a local tragedy into one of the most widely publicized and enduring unsolved crimes in the United States. Its legacy is defined not only by the unanswered question of who killed John Benet, but also by the ways in which the investigation and media shaped public understanding of criminal justice. In the years after the crime, Boulder's law enforcement faced sustained criticism for its handling of the initial investigation, the failure to secure the crime scene, to limit access to the home, and to preserve physical evidence impaired future efforts. The relationship between the police and the district attorney's office remains strained, with both entities following conflicting theories and clashing over prosecutorial decisions. These divisions compromise the investigation's coherence and effectiveness. For the Ramsey family, public suspicion never entirely faded, despite the 2008 exoneration. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in 2006, never seeing a resolution to her daughter's case. John Ramsey has since remarried and remained vocal about his hope for justice. Burke Ramsey, who gave limited interviews as a child, spoke publicly for the first time in 2016. His appearance in a television special reignited media attention and spurred defamation lawsuits against outlets that had speculated about his involvement. Public interest in the case has remained high, fueled by books, television specials, and documentaries. Each retelling revisits the same body of evidence, often drawing different conclusions based on emphasis, interpretation, or new forensic commentary. True crime audiences have engaged with the case for decades, reflecting its cultural significance beyond the immediate tragedy. Technological advancements continue to offer hope for breakthroughs. The development of genealogical DNA analysis, which helped solve other cold cases like that of the Golden State Killer, prompted new calls for similar efforts in John Benet's case. In late 2021, Boulder police confirmed they were consulting with state and federal experts about using updated DNA techniques. As of 2023, officials stated that hundreds of DNA samples had been tested, and new avenues were being pursued. Despite this, no matches have emerged. The male DNA profile found on John Benet's clothing remains unidentified. While some believe it holds the key to solving the case, others question whether it truly belongs to the perpetrator. The reliability of touch DNA, the potential for secondary transfer, and questions surrounding contamination continue to challenge forensic conclusions. The broader impact of the John Benet case includes increased scrutiny of child pageantry, media ethics, and police conduct. It became a case study in how public narratives can be shaped long before legal determinations are made. It also highlighted the risks of investigative leaks, trial by media, and the balance between transparency and confidentiality in active investigations. Today, a cold case team within the Boulder Police Department maintains custody of the evidence and periodically reviews new technologies. Officials say they remain committed to pursuing justice, but acknowledge that key evidence may never yield definitive answers. The house where JonBenet died has changed ownership multiple times, but the case continues to draw visitors, journalists, and researchers. JonBenet Ramsey's name has become synonymous with tragic mystery. While theories persist and documents continue to be examined, the essential facts remain unchanged. A 6-year-old girl was killed in her home, under circumstances that defy a clear explanation. The path to justice, obstructed by early errors and enduring uncertainty, remains elusive. Tina Thomas was born in Germany in February 1977 and adopted as an infant by Tommy and Cindy Thomas, who raised her in Helena, Alabama. She grew up in a close-knit household and attended Pelham High School, later enrolling at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Described by those who knew her as kind, shy, and meticulous, Tina led a structured life shaped by both her family's support and her own sense of responsibility. In college, Tina met Gabe Watson, a fellow student who worked part-time as a delivery driver. Their relationship grew steadily over the years, marked by mutual interests and shared routines. By 2001, their bond had deepened, and they became engaged. Friends noted Gabe's protective nature and Tina's quiet confidence. Despite some minor differences in temperament, Tina being more reserved and Gabe more assertive, the couple seemed compatible. Tina had a history of heart surgery in her teenage years to correct an irregular heartbeat, a condition closely monitored by her physicians. By her 20s, she was considered healthy and able to participate in physical activities with appropriate caution. As their wedding day approached, the couple finalized plans for a 2-week honeymoon in Australia. Included in their itinerary was a scuba diving trip to the Great Barrier Reef, an adventure they both looked forward to. Gabe had been a certified rescue diver since 1999, while Tina had recently completed a beginner's diving course to prepare for the trip. She was eager but cautious about diving, aware of her limited experience and health background. The wedding took place on October 11, 2003, in a church near Birmingham. Surrounded by friends and family, Tina wore a white gown and carried a bouquet of calla lilies. The ceremony was traditional and joyful. Just days later, on October 16th, the newlyweds boarded a flight to Sydney, beginning a journey that would change both of their lives. Tina and Gabe Watson arrived in Australia on October 16, 2003. Their itinerary included sightseeing in Sydney, a visit to the Gold Coast, and a diving trip with Mike Ball Dive Expeditions to the wreck of the SS Yongala. They booked a 7-day adventure package aboard the SpoilSport, a live-aboard dive vessel offering guided tours of historic wreck sites along the Great Barrier Reef. In the months leading up to the honeymoon, Tina had taken basic scuba lessons but had limited open water diving experience, just 5 lifetime dives. Gabe, on the other hand, was a certified rescue diver with over 50 logged dives, having obtained his certification in 1999. He was expected to be Tina's dive buddy during their underwater excursions. The Yongala wreck, a popular yet advanced dive site located off the coast of Townsville, Queensland, was known for strong currents and rich marine life. It was a challenging location, typically recommended for experienced divers. Tina had recently purchased new dive gear, including a buoyancy control device, regulator, and mask. The couple reportedly tested some of the equipment in a local pool prior to their trip. Despite Gabe's experience, there were reports of tension between him and Tina regarding dive planning. Tina's father later stated that she had expressed concerns about diving with Gabe, saying she was apprehensive about relying on him underwater. Upon arriving in Townsville, they boarded the Spoilsport on October 20th. Among the passengers were international tourists and experienced divers, along with the crew. Gabe completed paperwork designating himself as Tina's dive buddy and initialed a section indicating he would assist her as needed. The expedition included a series of checkout dives prior to the main event. The dive at the SS Yongala, scheduled for October 22nd. In pre-dive briefings, staff emphasized the need for caution due to the site's depth and current conditions. Divers were instructed to descend and ascend along a mooring line to manage the current safely. Tina participated in a shallow checkout dive the day before the Yongala trip, during which she reportedly showed signs of unease but completed the dive without major issues. As the day of the wreck dive approached, conditions appeared favorable, though the current was known to shift unexpectedly. On the morning of October 22nd, divers prepared to descend into one of the most storied and challenging underwater sites on the Australian coast. On the morning of October 22nd, 2003, the Spoilsport anchored above the SS Yongala wreck. The dive briefing reiterated the importance of adhering to the mooring line during descent and ascent due to the site's unpredictable current. Conditions were moderate, with a steady current reported at depth. Gabe and Tina prepared to dive with their group, both equipped with standard scuba gear, including aluminum tanks, buoyancy compensators, and dive computers. As the group entered the water around 10:30 a.m., divers began descending the mooring line in pairs. Witnesses reported that Tina appeared anxious as she approached the descent, clinging to Gabe before starting her descent slightly behind him. Gabe later stated that they began descending together, but that Tina seemed to panic shortly after submerging. He claimed she knocked off his mask and regulator, prompting him to surface briefly to recover. Several divers and crew members contested this version, stating they saw Gabe ascend alone while Tina was sinking motionless. Other divers observed Tina sinking vertically, her arms extended, not making any swimming motions. A dive instructor descended rapidly and retrieved her from the seabed, approximately 30 meters below the surface. Tina was unresponsive and showed no signs of breathing. She was brought aboard the Spoilsport, where CPR was initiated immediately by the crew and a physician on board. Efforts to revive her continued for over an hour. At 11:37 a.m., Tina was declared dead. Her body was flown to Townsville for post-mortem examination. Gabe gave an initial statement to police at the scene, describing a sudden emergency in which Tina panicked and slipped away from him. He claimed he tried to assist her, but was unable to reach her after his own equipment was compromised. Dive staff and other passengers, however, raised concerns about inconsistencies in his account and his behavior immediately following the incident. Back on the Spoilsport, divers and crew were unsettled by Gabe's demeanor, noting a lack of visible emotion. Some recalled him being calm and composed, even joking with staff within hours of the incident. Others described him repeatedly stating that Tina had just slipped away. Investigators took note of these statements as they began compiling information on the incident. The dive that was meant to be a highlight of the Watsons' honeymoon ended in tragedy. Tina Watson's death raised immediate questions, not only about diving safety and preparedness, but also about the circumstances under which she drowned. Following Tina Watson's death, Queensland Police initiated a formal investigation. Her body was transported to the Townsville morgue, where a full autopsy was conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. David Williams. The examination confirmed that Tina had drowned. Her lungs were filled with water, and there was evidence of an air embolism, though it was not identified as the primary cause of death. Bruising on her upper arms suggested possible restraint, or force applied shortly before she lost consciousness. Investigators reviewed statements from the dive crew and passengers aboard the spoil sport. Many recounted inconsistencies in Gabe Watson's version of events. He told authorities that Tina had panicked and pulled off his mask and regulator, forcing him to ascend to the surface. However, no witnesses corroborated seeing a struggle, and dive instructors who responded reported that she was sinking without resistance. Gabe's dive computer showed he had briefly descended and then surfaced rapidly, spending only a short period at depth. The Queensland Police Service questioned Gabe Watson multiple times during the days following the incident. He returned to the U.S. shortly after, with the consent of Australian authorities, but was requested to remain available for further inquiries. In Alabama, Tina's family began raising concerns. Her father, Tommy Thomas, publicly expressed doubts about the circumstances of her death and began gathering documents, including Tina's medical records and dive certification details. Dive safety experts noted that while Tina was inexperienced, the site's conditions were within the capabilities of a diver with proper support. As her designated dive buddy and a certified rescue diver, Gabe was expected to monitor her closely. Questions were raised about his decision to leave her underwater, instead of attempting a direct rescue or calling for immediate help. Meanwhile, the autopsy results were forwarded to the coroner's office. Tina's cause of death was ruled as drowning, but the manner remained undetermined pending further investigation. No charges were filed at that stage. Queensland authorities continued to collect evidence, including dive logs, underwater photographs, and witness testimonies. The dive computer data showed Gabe had made only a brief descent, and his rapid ascent had not triggered his own dive alarm, a point that puzzled experts. Back in Alabama, Tina's funeral was held at a local church, attended by family, friends, and former classmates. Gabe Watson stood among the mourners, but remained under scrutiny. The Thomas family began pressing for answers, determined to understand what had happened 100 feet below the surface off Australia's coast. In 2008, 5 years after Tina Watson's death, a formal coroner's inquest was held in Townsville, Queensland. Led by Coroner David Glasgow, the inquest aimed to determine the circumstances surrounding her drowning and assess whether criminal charges were warranted. The proceedings lasted nearly 2 weeks and included testimonies from dive experts, passengers, crew, and investigators. Central to the inquest was Gabe Watson's behavior during and after the dive. Dive instructors testified that Tina appeared to sink passively, with no sign of panic or resistance. Expert analysis of the dive computers showed Gabe's descent lasted barely 2 minutes, followed by a rapid ascent. He had not attempted to retrieve Tina, nor had he signaled for help until reaching the surface. Witnesses described his demeanor as detached, noting that he did not inquire about his wife's condition after the rescue. The inquest also revealed that Gabe had asked Tina's father, prior to the trip, to increase her life insurance and name him as beneficiary. Though the policy was not altered, the request was noted by the court. Additionally, records showed that Tina had expressed concern about her limited diving skills and was unsure about diving at the Yongala site. Forensic evidence was discussed in detail. Bruises found on Tina's upper arms were consistent with being held or grabbed. Dr. David Williams stated the marks likely occurred shortly before death. Expert witnesses debated the plausibility of Gabe's account that Tina had dislodged his mask and regulator, with several concluding that such a scenario would not explain her passive descent or his lack of a rescue attempt. In his findings, Coroner Glasgow concluded that Gabe Watson failed in his duty as a dive buddy and rescue diver. He described Watson's actions as inexplicable and unjustifiable, stating that Tina's death was not a simple diving accident. The inquest found that Watson allowed his wife to sink without assisting her, and that his explanation was inconsistent with both physical evidence and dive protocol. Glasgow referred the case to the Director of Public Prosecutions, recommending that Watson be charged with manslaughter. The finding was a significant development in a case that had, until then, remained unresolved. The coroner's conclusion emphasized that Gabe's conduct during the dive and his conflicting statements merited criminal consideration. Following the inquest, Queensland Police formally requested that Gabe Watson return to Australia to face charges. Legal discussions began between Australian and U.S. authorities regarding extradition. Public interest in the case surged, fueled by media coverage and the emotional appeals from Tina's family. The next phase of the investigation would focus on legal accountability for a death that had haunted two countries. Following the coroner's recommendation, Australian authorities charged Gabe Watson with manslaughter in 2008. Negotiations between the Queensland government and the United States led to a formal extradition request in 2009. Watson voluntarily returned to Australia in May 2009 and was taken into custody upon arrival. He was held in a Brisbane prison pending trial. The charge alleged that Watson had failed to meet his obligations as a dive buddy, resulting in Tina's death through criminal negligence. Legal proceedings in Queensland moved slowly. In June 2009, Watson's legal team sought to have the case dismissed, arguing insufficient evidence for a conviction. Prosecutors countered that Watson's inaction during the dive, his inconsistent statements, and the bruising on Tina's arms warranted a trial. After pre-trial hearings, a plea deal was negotiated. In June 2010, Watson pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter by failing to fulfill his duty of care as a dive buddy. The Brisbane Supreme Court accepted the plea. Prosecutor Brendan Campbell stated Watson had failed to respond when Tina got into difficulty and did not perform basic rescue measures expected of someone with his training. Justice Peter Dutney sentenced Watson to 4.5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 12 months. The judge acknowledged the plea and time already served in custody as factors in the sentence. The verdict sparked outrage in both Australia and the United States. Tina's family called the sentence a slap on the wrist, expressing disappointment that the court had not pursued the original murder charge. Public reaction echoed their frustration, with media outlets and commentators criticizing the outcome as disproportionately lenient. The Queensland government responded by reviewing its sentencing guidelines for similar cases. Watson served 18 months in a Queensland prison before being deported to the United States in November 2010. Upon arrival in Alabama, he was met by FBI agents and Alabama law enforcement. Authorities announced that Watson would face additional charges under state law. Alabama Attorney General Troy King had pursued a parallel investigation and believed that Watson could be held accountable for Tina's death under different legal grounds. The Australian proceedings closed with Watson's release and deportation, but the legal saga was far from over. With renewed efforts by Tina's family and state prosecutors, the case would soon return to the courtroom, this time in the jurisdiction where Tina had lived and planned her future. Upon Gabe Watson's deportation in November 2010, Alabama authorities moved swiftly to prosecute him under state law. A grand jury in Jefferson County indicted him on 2 counts: capital murder during a kidnapping and capital murder for pecuniary gain. Prosecutors argued that Watson lured Tina to Australia under false pretenses, intending to kill her and collect life insurance benefits. The kidnapping charge was based on the allegation that he isolated her underwater and abandoned her without aid. Watson was arrested and held without bond in Birmingham. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Don Valiska, pursued the death penalty. They presented the theory that Watson had formulated a plan to murder Tina and had deliberately caused her death during the dive. Allegations resurfaced that he had asked for changes to Tina's life insurance policy shortly before their wedding, though the policy was never altered. Watson's defense team challenged the charges, asserting that they were based on speculation and inadmissible evidence. They filed motions to dismiss the case, citing double jeopardy, abuse of process, and the lack of jurisdiction over an incident that occurred outside the United States. The court allowed the trial to proceed, but excluded certain pieces of evidence, including prior allegations not directly linked to the crime. The trial began in February 2012. Prosecutors called witnesses from Australia, including dive instructors and investigators, to testify about Watson's conduct and the forensic findings. The defense countered that Watson had no motive to kill Tina, citing the lack of any financial gain and his cooperation with authorities. They emphasized the absence of definitive physical evidence proving intentional harm. During cross-examination, prosecutors struggled to establish a clear motive beyond circumstantial claims. The alleged insurance scheme had not materialized, and there was no record of prior violence or threats. The defense argued that Watson had made a tragic mistake by surfacing instead of assisting Tina, but that error did not amount to murder. They also noted that he had already served time in Australia for the same incident. On February 23, 2012, Judge Tommy Nail dismissed the case before it could go to the jury. He ruled that the state had failed to present sufficient evidence to support a conviction for capital murder. The judge stated there was no proof of premeditation or an intent to kill. Watson was released immediately, ending the U.S. legal effort to hold him criminally responsible. The dismissal triggered emotional responses. Tina's family expressed devastation, maintaining their belief that justice had not been served. Prosecutors defended their actions, insisting they had pursued the case in good faith. With no further legal avenues available, the criminal proceedings surrounding Tina Watson's death came to a final conclusion. Following the dismissal of charges in Alabama, the legal chapter of Tina Watson's case closed, but public scrutiny continued. Tina's parents, Tommy and Cindy Thomas, remained vocal. They expressed frustration with both the Australian and American justice systems, arguing that neither delivered accountability. Their public statements emphasized the need for reform in handling international cases involving suspicious deaths. Media coverage of the case remained steady. Major outlets revisited the story with renewed interest, airing interviews with family members, legal experts, and former dive crew. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some viewed Gabe Watson as a man wrongfully accused after a tragic accident. Others remained convinced of his guilt, pointing to his conduct, inconsistencies in his story, and his perceived lack of grief. In Alabama, Watson resumed a low-profile life. In 2008, before returning to Australia to face manslaughter charges, he had remarried. His new wife, Kim Lewis, was a lawyer. The couple avoided media attention. Watson seldom spoke publicly, but in brief statements he maintained that Tina's death was a diving accident and denied any intent to harm her. Tina's family pursued other avenues. They worked with state legislators to advocate for changes in wrongful death law, hoping to prevent similar outcomes in future cases. The Thomases also participated in public forums and memorial events, ensuring Tina's story remained known. They contributed to diving safety awareness, emphasizing the importance of proper training and oversight, especially for novice divers in challenging conditions. Civil litigation also emerged. In 2006, before the criminal trials, the Thomas family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Watson. The case was settled under confidential terms. Though no further legal action followed the U.S. trial, the case continued to influence public debate about international jurisdiction, extradition policy, and the limits of legal cooperation between countries. The spoilsport crew, still active in Australia's dive industry, implemented stricter dive protocols. The incident led to revised procedures for verifying diver readiness and buddy assignments. Tina's story became a reference point in dive safety courses, underscoring the importance of experience, equipment checks, and emergency response. Years later, true crime programs revisited the case, further embedding it in the public consciousness. Despite the legal outcomes, many questions remained unresolved. For Tina's family, the emotional loss never faded. For others, the case symbolized the complexity of seeking justice across borders and the enduring impact of one life lost, far from home. The death of Tina Watson and the complex legal journey that followed left a lasting impact on both diving safety standards and international legal procedures. In the diving community, the case became a reference point for improving buddy system protocols and evaluating diver readiness. Dive tour operators, particularly in Australia, revised their practices to better assess diver compatibility and experience levels before allowing participation in advanced dives like the Yongala wreck. Training programs now often include the Watson case as a case study to highlight the importance of pre-dive planning, communication, and emergency procedures. Instructors emphasize that divers must be able to rely on each other in high-risk environments, especially when one partner is inexperienced. As a result, many operators began implementing stricter requirements for less experienced divers and more thorough pre-dive briefings. Legally, the case underscored the challenges of pursuing justice in incidents involving multiple jurisdictions. Tina's death sparked debates about the limitations of extradition treaties, the admissibility of international evidence, and the double jeopardy doctrine. Critics of the Alabama prosecution argued that emotional appeals had outpaced the available evidence, while supporters believed that the U.S. trial was necessary to seek full accountability. The broader legal discourse included questions about the balance between prosecutorial discretion and the need for international collaboration. Australian and American officials acknowledged the strain between their respective systems. In future cases, better coordination and earlier communication may help clarify jurisdictional authority and avoid redundant or conflicting proceedings. For Tina's family, the pursuit of justice became a defining mission. Though disappointed by the legal outcomes, they found purpose in advocating for systemic changes. Their efforts helped raise awareness of the emotional toll faced by victims' families when cases span continents and cultures. Tina's name became associated not only with tragedy, but also with the persistence of those seeking reform. Public interest in the case has endured. Documentaries, articles, and podcasts continue to revisit the story, often focusing on the questions left unanswered. Did Tina panic and sink by accident, or was she deliberately abandoned? Why did Gabe Watson behave as he did, and what truly happened during those final minutes underwater? Despite forensic evidence and witness accounts, definitive answers remain elusive. Ultimately, Tina Watson's story is remembered as a case that challenged the assumptions of safety, trust, and justice. It reshaped practices within a specialized community and sparked discussions that extend beyond a single dive. Her legacy endures not only in memorials and legal records, but also in every safety check, training session, and dive briefing that now carries her story forward. Independence, Missouri, with its quiet streets and strong community bonds, seemed the perfect backdrop for Randy and Teresa Stone's life. The couple had built what appeared to be a stable, loving home. Randy was known as a devoted husband and father, deeply invested in both his family and his work. He owned a successful insurance business and was actively involved in his church, New Hope Baptist, a cornerstone of their daily lives. Teresa, bright and personable, was well liked within the community. Together, they were often seen as a model couple, high school sweethearts who had built a life grounded in faith and mutual support. Their children, their faith, and their community activities were central to their identity. New Hope Baptist Church wasn't just a place of worship, it was an extension of their family. Randy, in particular, held a strong sense of duty toward the church. He volunteered his time, participated in Bible studies, and was a trusted confidant for many of the congregants. Teresa, too, was an active member, involved in women's ministries and fellowship groups. Their lives were deeply enmeshed in a religious community that valued loyalty, tradition, and moral clarity. To outsiders, the Stones lived an enviable life, one defined by love, purpose, and a deep connection to both God and community. But beneath the calm, a storm had begun to form, quietly, imperceptibly, and dangerously. David Love arrived at New Hope Baptist Church with energy and charm. A former Marine with a commanding presence, he quickly captivated the congregation. His sermons were emotional and engaging, his demeanor friendly yet authoritative. For many, he seemed a spiritual anchor, particularly for the Stone family, who welcomed him warmly into their lives. Pastor Love's background added to his appeal. He had a reputation for understanding people's struggles and guiding them through personal turmoil. To Randy, he was a friend and spiritual advisor. To Teresa, he became something more. The closeness began innocently, shared prayers, counseling sessions, community projects. The Stones often invited Love to family gatherings. Over time, his presence in their lives deepened. Church members began to notice the pastor's frequent appearances at the Stone household. Still, nothing overt seemed out of place. Love was married himself, a father, and held in high esteem. His growing bond with Teresa, while perhaps notable, remained within the boundaries of pastoral care, at least on the surface. Privately, however, the dynamic was shifting. Love and Teresa began confiding in each other beyond spiritual matters. They spoke of their frustrations, their dreams, and increasingly, their emotional needs. Teresa, who sometimes felt overshadowed in Randy's structured world, found validation in Love's attention. Love, too, sought something deeper. The demands of leadership, coupled with personal dissatisfaction, drew him toward Teresa. What started as empathy turned into emotional intimacy. By the time the boundary was crossed, it was done in silence, quiet conversations turning into secret rendezvous. The pastor who preached virtue was now entangled in deception. The spiritual leader had stepped into darkness. The connection between him and Teresa would not remain secret forever, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The affair between Teresa Stone and Pastor David Love intensified gradually, shaped by secrecy and emotional dependency. What had begun as comforting words behind closed doors became late-night phone calls, discreet meetings, and veiled glances during church gatherings. The pair, bound by forbidden desire, created a parallel world where their affair could flourish without suspicion, at least for a time. Teresa's internal conflict was evident. She continued to fulfill her roles as wife, mother, and church member, maintaining the facade of a devoted spouse. But behind that image was a woman deeply involved with the man who had become both her lover and her spiritual guide. Love, who counseled others on morality, now waded deeper into duplicity. To avoid discovery, they devised routines and signals. They met away from prying eyes, sometimes at motels or in secluded areas. Their communication became coded, the tone of their interactions shifting in subtle but telling ways. Love counseled Teresa on how to avoid raising Randy's suspicions, while Teresa began rewriting her own justifications for continuing the relationship. Church members who observed their closeness began to grow uneasy. A few murmured concerns, but the idea of their pastor and Teresa in a romantic relationship seemed too far-fetched to confront directly. The spiritual authority Love held gave him insulation from scrutiny. For Teresa, community respect provided similar cover. The deeper their affair ran, the more they began to consider a future together, one no longer burdened by Randy's presence. Love, increasingly emboldened, began making suggestions that shocked even Teresa at first. Conversations that had once centered on guilt now drifted toward possibility. A new life, a life without Randy. That seed of an idea, spoken first in hypotheticals, would take root. Hidden desire was about to yield deadly intent. Randy Stone, a man of routine and faith, had always trusted his wife. Yet in the final months of his life, he began to notice subtle but troubling changes. Teresa had become distant, her mood often distracted. She spent more time away from home and became defensive when questioned. Her once open demeanor was now guarded. At work, Randy remained committed and meticulous, but colleagues noted he appeared more preoccupied than usual. At home, he tried to restore their connection, planning dinners, initiating conversations. But Teresa responded with polite detachment. Randy confided in a few close friends, mentioning that something felt wrong, though he never voiced direct suspicions. Around New Hope Baptist Church, whispers started to circulate. Some congregants observed that Pastor Love and Teresa were unusually close. Their interactions during events seemed personal, too familiar. Still, no one dared confront them. Love's spiritual authority and Teresa's standing in the church made direct accusations unthinkable. Behind the scenes, Love and Teresa continued their affair. The danger of discovery only seemed to deepen their bond. They shared dreams of a future together, one where they no longer had to hide. But such a life required the removal of a single obstacle: Randy. What might have remained a tragic affair was now morphing into something more sinister. The couple, consumed by their own narrative, began to believe they were entitled to a new beginning, no matter the cost. Plans were discussed, hints dropped, but still cloaked in ambiguity. Randy, ever the optimist, clung to the hope that things would improve. He had no idea that the walls around him were quietly closing in, that the people he trusted most had begun plotting a betrayal so profound it would shake the very foundation of the community. March 31st, 2010, began like any other day for Randy Stone. He left home and went to his insurance office in Independence, Missouri, unaware it would be his last. By afternoon, Randy's mother, unable to reach him, grew concerned. She drove to the office where she found the door locked but his car outside. Inside, she discovered a horrifying scene. Her son slumped behind his desk, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. The news shattered the community. Randy's death was ruled a homicide almost immediately. Police noted no signs of forced entry or robbery. His wallet and watch were untouched. Whoever had killed him knew him, or at least didn't come with theft as the motive. Word of Randy's death spread quickly through New Hope Baptist Church. Shock turned to grief, and then to unease. Pastor David Love delivered comforting words during a vigil, but some found his composure unsettling. Teresa, visibly emotional, told police she had no idea who would want to harm her husband. Investigators questioned those close to Randy. Co-workers described him as stable and reliable. Friends recalled recent conversations where Randy mentioned concerns about his marriage. Detectives began piecing together a timeline. They reviewed surveillance footage from the area and examined call records. Slowly, inconsistencies emerged. A key clue came from a piece of paper recovered from Teresa's office trash. A torn love letter addressed to her from someone identified only by initials. The tone was romantic, intimate, and clearly not written by Randy. Handwriting analysis and contextual clues would soon point in a singular direction. The evidence, circumstantial at first, began to outline a deeply troubling portrait. This was not a random act of violence. It was targeted, calculated, and born of betrayal from within the very circles Randy had trusted most. Detectives intensified their investigation, and suspicion quickly began to center on Teresa Stone and Pastor David Love. The torn love letter recovered from Teresa's trash contained handwriting that closely resembled Love's. Its contents hinted at a deep romantic involvement and a shared desire for a future together, without Randy. Phone records added to the mounting evidence. In the days leading up to Randy's death, Teresa and Love had exchanged hundreds of text messages. Some were deleted, but enough remained to suggest more than pastoral support. Investigators subpoenaed cell tower data, uncovering that Love's phone had pinged near Randy's office around the time of the murder. When questioned, Teresa initially denied any romantic involvement with Love, but faced with the letter, call records, and inconsistencies in her timeline, she eventually admitted to the affair. She claimed it had been ongoing for years, and that she had grown emotionally distant from Randy as her feelings for Love intensified. Love, when first brought in for questioning, was calm and cooperative. He denied any involvement in Randy's death and downplayed the affair. However, his alibi was weak. He had no concrete explanation for his location during the time of the murder. Surveillance footage showed a car matching his at a location near the crime scene. Investigators also discovered that Randy had taken out a life insurance policy worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, naming Teresa as the beneficiary. The motive became clearer: emotional entanglement, financial gain, and the desire to remove an obstacle to a forbidden future. With the physical evidence, digital trails, and confessions aligning, prosecutors prepared charges. The unraveling was complete. What began as whispers of infidelity had exposed a conspiracy that led to murder. The next step would bring those responsible into the courtroom. Following the growing body of evidence, authorities moved swiftly. On June 9, 2010, David Love was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and armed criminal action. Days later, Teresa Stone was also taken into custody and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The arrests sent shockwaves through the community. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Love eventually confessed. He admitted to entering Randy Stone's office under the pretense of a visit, carrying a firearm. He described a confrontation that turned fatal. He shot Randy once in the head and fled. Love claimed he acted alone, but prosecutors were skeptical of how deeply Teresa had been involved. Teresa, after initial resistance, entered a guilty plea to conspiracy to commit murder. In her confession, she detailed years of emotional turmoil, her affair with Love, and discussions about a life free from Randy. Though she denied asking Love to kill her husband explicitly, she acknowledged that their conversations often drifted towards such a possibility. The courtroom heard how the relationship between Love and Teresa had blurred the lines between fantasy and fatal intent. Friends and relatives testified about changes in Teresa's demeanor, the suspicious bond with Love, and Randy's growing concern before his death. David Love, confronted with both physical and testimonial evidence, chose to avoid trial. In November 2011, he pled guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. In April 2012, Teresa was sentenced to 8 years in prison. She apologized in court, expressing regret for her actions and the pain caused. The judge cited her cooperation and lack of a direct role in the shooting as factors in her sentence. The confessions brought legal closure, but emotional wounds remained. The betrayal by those closest to Randy Stone had left a lasting scar on everyone who knew him. Although David Love had already pleaded guilty, the legal proceedings surrounding his case revealed the depth of planning and deception. Prosecutors presented records of cell phone data, GPS tracking, and surveillance footage, all supporting the timeline of Randy's murder. Forensic evidence confirmed that Love had fired the fatal shot. In court, he showed little emotion as the details of the crime were recounted. David Love's sentence, life in prison with the possibility of parole, reflected the severity of his actions. The plea deal avoided a lengthy trial, but didn't spare him from harsh judgment in the public eye. In interviews, detectives and prosecutors described him as manipulative, hiding his darker intentions behind a mask of pastoral care. Teresa Stone's case followed closely. Her plea deal meant no trial, but her sentencing hearing brought emotional testimony. Members of Randy's family described the impact of his loss. Friends from church recalled Randy's dedication, his kindness, and their disbelief at Teresa's betrayal. Teresa, dressed plainly, addressed the court with a quiet apology, saying she never meant for Randy to die. The prosecution emphasized her role in enabling the crime, keeping secrets, supporting the affair, and failing to warn Randy when plans to harm him were discussed. The defense argued that she was emotionally manipulated by Love, describing her as vulnerable and overwhelmed. In April 2012, Teresa received an 8-year prison sentence. While some felt it was too lenient, others acknowledged the complexity of her situation. She was sent to a Missouri women's prison, where she began serving her sentence shortly afterward. The legal proceedings offered a form of justice, but for Randy's family, no outcome could undo the loss. The trials revealed a chilling truth. A respected pastor and a trusted wife had conspired, through action and silence, to end a man's life for love, lust, and freedom. In the years following the convictions, the community of Independence continued to reckon with the tragedy. New Hope Baptist Church, once a place of spiritual strength, faced deep wounds. Attendance declined. Members struggled to reconcile the teachings of faith with the actions of a pastor who had used his position to manipulate and destroy. Randy Stone's family focused on healing. His children, deeply affected by the loss of their father and the betrayal by their mother, leaned on extended family and counseling. They rarely spoke publicly, choosing privacy as they rebuilt their lives. Randy's memory was honored by friends and loved ones, many of whom remembered his generosity and devotion. David Love was incarcerated at the Jefferson City Correctional Center, eligible for parole after serving a minimum term. He remained behind bars, his once promising future replaced by prison walls. Occasional interviews and statements showed a man both repentant and reflective, but for many, the damage he caused outweighed any admission of guilt. Teresa Stone was released from prison in 2016 after serving a portion of her sentence. She returned to a vastly changed life. estranged from parts of her family and community. There were no public interviews, no attempts at explanation. She chose silence and seclusion, avoiding the media spotlight. The case remained a cautionary tale, a reminder of how seemingly stable lives can unravel under pressure and deceit. Law enforcement professionals and prosecutors involved in the case later cited it as an example of the importance of digital forensics, behavioral analysis, and persistence in uncovering the truth. Years later, Independent still remembers Randy Stone, not for how he died, but for the life he led. The story, while marked by betrayal, ultimately centered on a man whose quiet strength left a lasting impression on those who knew him. The murder of Randy Stone was more than a criminal case. It was a profound disruption of trust, community, and faith. The facts of the case revealed a deadly convergence of desire, secrecy, and manipulation. A respected pastor and a devoted wife crossed moral and legal boundaries, transforming personal failings into a conspiracy that ended a life. Investigators, friends, and community members struggled to make sense of how events escalated from private indiscretions to a public tragedy. The affair between Teresa Stone and David Love, long hidden behind smiles and sermons, had been enabled by positions of trust and the assumption of virtue. Their ability to deceive those closest to them added to the emotional fallout. The case forced hard conversations within churches and families about boundaries, accountability, and the danger of unspoken grievances. Love's misuse of spiritual authority served as a warning about the corrupting potential of unchecked power. Teresa's silence and complicity illustrated how emotional entanglement can cloud judgment and lead to irreversible choices. For law enforcement, the investigation highlighted the value of forensic detail and digital evidence. Cell phone records, surveillance footage, and handwritten notes were instrumental in building a timeline and revealing intent. The puzzle, once assembled, left little room for doubt. But beyond courtrooms and prison sentences, the story endures in memory. Randy's name lives on as a symbol of unassuming integrity, a man who trusted deeply, worked hard, and lived with quiet faith. His death became a national story, but for those who knew him, the headlines could never capture the full measure of who he was. The tragedy left scars, but also lessons. It reminded a community that appearances can deceive, that trust must be earned and guarded, and that choices made in secrecy can echo far beyond their intended reach.